There was a time when the name Sam Bankman-Fried meant safety in a world gone mad. Not only was he hailed as the responsible face of crypto, he was treated as the genius who would finally drag this chaotic new money into something that looked like a real financial system. Then investigators opened the books and found it, an $8 to $10 billion black hole where customer funds were supposed to be. This was not a minor accounting error. It was one of the largest financial shortfalls in modern history, a gap so huge that veteran fraud investigators had to double-check the numbers just to believe them. On paper, FTX had been worth $32 billion, backed by blue-chip venture capital, splashed across magazine covers as the future of finance. Behind the scenes, there was a balance sheet that did not balance, a missing mountain of money that belonged to ordinary people. Sam's story is one of speed, power, and illusion. In just a few years, he went from MIT math nerd to Jane Street trader to founder of Alameda Research, and then FTX, building an empire that stretched from Hong Kong trading floors to Bahamian penthouses. He became a billionaire before turning 30, a political megadonor writing 8-figure checks, a constant presence in Washington hearings, promising to make crypto safe, regulated, and boring. The more chaotic the industry looked, the more he sold himself as its calm center, and the world believed him. Super Bowl commercials told viewers FTX was the platform for people who did not want to miss the next big thing, with Larry David shrugging through history as the skeptical guy who, this time, was wrong. Tom Brady and Gisele Bündchen appeared as polished evangelists for the brand. Steph Curry smiled into the camera and said he was not an expert, he just trusted FTX. In Miami, the Heat's arena shed its old name and lit up the skyline as FTX Arena, a glowing promise that this new wealth had arrived and would be staying. The message was simple: this is safe, this is serious. This is not some shady corner of the internet. But as those ads played and those billboards went up, customer deposits flowed into FTX and then, quietly, out the back door. While users saw tidy balances on their screens, Alameda was drawing on a secret credit line, shielded by special code that let it run a multi-billion-dollar negative balance without triggering alarms. It is an example of what happens when complexity and charisma are allowed to replace boring questions like, where is the money exactly? So what was this really? The tragedy of a visionary who flew too close to the sun, or the work of a calculating operator who built a machine to siphon billions from his own customers. Over the next 2 hours, let me take you back to MIT dorm rooms and Hong Kong offices, to late-night Slack messages and quiet code changes, and finally into a courtroom where the golden boy of crypto stands facing judgment, and the black hole in his balance sheet demands an answer. To understand why that black hole matters, you have to understand what FTX was supposed to be. A crypto exchange, in theory, is boring. It holds your assets in custody, matches buyers and sellers, takes a small fee, and keeps its own hands off the chips. It is the casino cage, not the gambler at the table. When it works, you never think about it. When it fails, you discover very quickly whose money was really on the line. FTX did not sell itself as a scrappy, chaotic startup. It sold itself as the grown-up in the room. In less than 3 years, it went from a niche derivatives venue to a $32 billion empire, raising over $1 billion from Sequoia, SoftBank, Temasek, and other blue-chip names who prided themselves on spotting the next great financial platform. There was a time when Super Bowl ads, stadium naming rights in Miami, and celebrity cameos from Tom Brady and Larry David all repeated the same message. This is the safe way into crypto, the regulated on-ramp for your family savings. On paper, the story was irresistible. A math prodigy from MIT, who had cut his teeth at Jane Street trading complex instruments, leaves Wall Street, launches a trading firm called Alameda Research, and then a matching engine called FTX to fix the broken crypto markets. His story is one of relentless optimization and moral urgency, at times inspiring and at times chilling. He sleeps on a beanbag in the office, drives a Toyota, and promises to give away almost all his future wealth to save lives and prevent global catastrophes. But behind that narrative, the structure quietly erased the line every exchange must protect. Customer deposits flowed into FTX, yet in the code, there was a special exemption for Alameda, a backdoor that let the hedge fund run a multi-billion-dollar negative balance without being liquidated like any ordinary user. The marketplace, that was supposed to be neutral, had given one favored player infinite credit, turning client chips into house money, and then marching that money into wildly leveraged bets. This is where FTX stops being just another failed company and becomes a lens on the age. It is not only a story about one man's rise and fall, it's an example of what happens when complex code, opaque balance sheets, and charismatic storytelling collide with weak oversight and insatiable ambition. When regulators are dazzled, auditors are out of their depth, and investors are grateful just to be let into the round, very simple questions about where the money actually lives go unanswered. Because of that, FTX matters far beyond crypto. It shows how modern financial manias are built, through jargon and yield promises, through moral language about helping the world, through the quiet normalization of risks that would have looked insane a decade earlier. In the next part of this story, let me take you back to the beginning of that mania, to the early arbitrage trades, the clever engineering, and the first tiny compromises that would finally grow into an $8 billion hole no one could ignore. Before the Super Bowl ads, before the $32 billion valuation, there was a time when Sam Bankman-Fried was just a quiet kid in suburban California, walking across the Stanford campus to go home. No penthouse, no private jets, just a house where dinner conversations sounded less like small talk and more like a philosophy seminar on ethics, law, and what a good society should look like. His parents weren't just lawyers, they were both Stanford law professors, specialists in tax policy and moral philosophy, people who argued for a living about what was fair, efficient, and rational. Power, money, justice, incentives, all of it floated through the air of that house like background radiation. For most kids, family time means cartoons. For Sam, it meant watching adults debate whether a policy that helped millions but hurt a few was morally acceptable. In that environment, numbers weren't just homework. They were tools. As a child, Sam latched onto math with an intensity that made everything else fade to the edges. Math camps during the summer, puzzle contests on weekends, logic games that most people would treat as a brain teaser, became, for him, a way of seeing the world. Expected value, probability, Bayesian updates, these weren't abstract terms. They were how decisions were scored. Friends remember him treating choices like equations. Should you cross the street now or wait? Calculate the risk. Should you go to a party or study? Estimate the long-term payoff. Feelings, embarrassment, social norms, these were variables that barely registered compared to the cold numbers of outcome and utility. His story is one of a mind that learned early to trust calculations over intuition, even when that made him look strange. Socially, he never tried very hard to fit in. He spoke too fast, mumbled through sentences, left long silences hanging after blunt comments. There was a dry, almost accidental humor to it. While other teenagers worried about outfits, Sam was wearing the same t-shirt and shorts, thinking about coin flip paradoxes and arbitrage puzzles. Optics were an afterthought. The math came first. Those early habits became a kind of uniform. Schlubby clothes, messy hair, no effort to project polish. It wasn't laziness, it was ideology. Attention spent on appearance was, to him, attention stolen from higher expected value activities like solving problems or, later, making more money to give away. At times inspiring and at times chilling, this belief that only outcomes mattered would become the spine of his empire. As he encountered utilitarian philosophy and effective altruism in college, the childhood instinct hardened into doctrine. If the goal was to maximize total good, then the only real question became, which actions produced the largest number on the scoreboard of human welfare? And once life is reduced to a scoreboard, it's an example of what happens when the line between clever optimization and quiet rationalization starts to blur. Because if the end truly justifies the means, how hard is it, really, to convince yourself that one more risk, one more shortcut, one more quiet violation is acceptable? In the next part of this story, let me take you back to the trading floors and dorm rooms where that quiet kid with loud numbers first learned how much money a single equation could move. On the surface, it starts in a quiet hallway at MIT. Fluorescent lights, problem sets clutched under one arm, and a skinny physics major walking fast because the P-set isn't due tomorrow. It was due yesterday. There was a time when this campus was just another elite pressure cooker, but for Sam Bankman-Fried, it became something else. The training ground where raw intelligence, optimization, and moral math fused into a single life mission. MIT is not a place that worships charm, it worships answers. Nights blurred into all-nighters, whiteboards filled with symbols, and friendships formed over problem sets that took 10 hours and still felt incomplete. In that world, sleep was negotiable, but getting the right solution was not. The culture told you that if you were smart enough, you could model anything, a circuit, a market, even the value of a human life. Into that environment walked effective altruism, not as a campus fad, but as a philosophy with equations. EA preached that if you were serious about helping people, you shouldn't just follow your heart, you should follow the numbers. Use reason and evidence, compare charities like experiments, and send your money where each dollar could save the most lives. Mosquito nets beat local art programs. Pandemic prevention beat feel-good volunteering. It sounded cold, but to a certain kind of mind, it was at times inspiring and at times chilling. Then came the twist. EA leaders weren't just telling students to donate, they were telling the smartest ones to earn to give. Don't become a social worker, become a quant. Don't avoid Wall Street, conquer it. Take the high-risk, high-reward jobs in trading firms and hedge funds, then funnel the winnings into high-impact causes. Suddenly, a career in a ruthless, zero-sum market could be framed as a moral crusade rather than a grab for wealth. For Sam, this was gasoline on dry tinder. His story is one of someone who didn't just want money, he wanted astronomical money. If a doctor could save thousands of lives in a career, an EA billionaire could, on paper, save millions or even billions. The bigger the bankroll, the bigger the impact. It's an example of what happens when a brain trained on problem sets starts treating the entire world as one giant optimization puzzle. So when Jane Street Capital came calling, quant trading wasn't just a job, it was a mission. Each trade, each algorithm, each edge in the market could eventually become vaccines, bed nets, and pandemic defenses. And when that belief takes root, that maximizing expected value is the highest good, another question quietly appears in the margins. If the numbers say one risky move could save 1 million lives, How wrong is it to bend a rule, shade a disclosure, or move a little customer money just this once? In the next chapter of this empire, let me take you back to the moment when that line stopped being theoretical and started running straight through billions of real dollars. That line leads straight into a glass tower in Lower Manhattan, where markets are treated less like a workplace and more like a war room. There was a time when, if a young mathematician wanted to weaponize numbers for maximum money and power, Jane Street Capital was where that training began. Jane Street is a secretive, quantitative trading firm, one of those quiet giants that never runs Super Bowl ads yet moves billions every day. Inside, the world is stripped down to prices, probabilities, and speed. Every millisecond shaved off a trade is an edge, every edge is a weapon, and every weapon is aimed at the same target, extracting profit from tiny mispricings before anyone else even notices they exist. Into this environment walked Sam Bankman-Fried, fresh from MIT, awkward, brilliant, and perfectly suited to a place where social skills were optional, but expected value calculations were a native language. His story is one of turning abstract math into live ammunition. As a trader, he wasn't placing big heroic bets on grand narratives. He was arbitraging tiny price differences between ETFs, options, and baskets of stocks, managing complex books where a fraction of a cent mattered, and where an equation could quietly move more money in a day than most families would see in a lifetime. The culture at Jane Street was its own kind of empire. New hires were thrown into relentless intellectual sparring, grilled on logic puzzles over lunch, pushed to argue both sides of a trade until every assumption was exposed. Decisions were framed in probabilities, not certainties. A 60% chance of gain with a 10% tail risk. A trade that made sense on average, even if it occasionally blew up. At times inspiring and at times chilling, it trained people to think of uncertainty not as fear, but as a field to be optimized. Sam absorbed that quickly. He learned to hit a button, moving tens of millions without flinching, to trust a model over a gut feeling, to see risk as something to be priced rather than avoided. It's an example of what happens when a young mind is taught that if the math checks out, hesitation is just wasted opportunity. But there was tension running under this comfortable, prestigious life. Jane Street already paid him far more than he would ever have seen in any normal job. Yet the effective altruism logic he'd embraced whispered that staying safe was itself a moral failure. If he could take bigger risks, build his own trading operation, scale his wealth another 100-fold, then donate it, wasn't he almost obligated to leave? Finally, the wargame mindset met a new battlefield. Leaving Jane Street meant walking away from risk limits, compliance teams, and veterans who said no when a trade went too far. The next arena, crypto, offered the same high-speed puzzles and the same hunger for edge, but almost no referees. Let me take you back to the moment when Sam decided that if markets were war, he was ready to fight without rules. For most young traders, the dream ends at Jane Street. Predictable millions, world-class colleagues, guardrails everywhere. You win, you lose, but the floor beneath you is solid. For Sam, that safety began to feel less like a prize and more like a ceiling. There was a time when the choice seemed almost absurd. On one side, an elite firm paying him more money than his parents would see in a decade, with health insurance, mentors, and a clear path to partnership. On the other side, a chaotic crypto market where exchanges crashed weekly, coins vanished overnight, and the rules were written in Twitter threads. One life promised comfort and prestige, the other promised volatility, anonymity, and if he was right, a level of wealth and power that made Jane Street look like training wheels. Inside his head, the conflict wasn't framed as comfort versus adventure. It was framed as math. Effective altruism had given him a language where every career decision became a spreadsheet cell. If he could make, say, $5 million a year at Jane Street, that was impressive. But if crypto arbitrage could generate 50 million or 500 million, the counterfactual impact exploded. Every dollar he didn't earn there, someone else probably wouldn't either. In that worldview, staying put began to look less responsible and more like negligence. Friends from the EA world reinforced the logic. They sat in dorm rooms, group houses, and dingy cafes, running back-of-the-envelope calculations on napkins and laptops. Price discrepancies between Japan and the US, slippage on illiquid tokens, sloppy risk engines on offshore exchanges. It wasn't just a trade, it was, in their language, a neglected opportunity. High upside, few competitors, almost no adult supervision. If the goal of his life was to move the needle on global suffering, how could he justify ignoring a gold rush that no one respectable wanted to touch? Let me take you back to those early conversations, because this is where the moral lines started to blur. The question wasn't only how much can we make, it was what if the fastest way to save the most lives runs through a morally gray industry? If he could extract billions from a casino-like market and then pour that money into pandemic prevention, AI safety, or animal welfare, didn't that change the moral scorecard? This is the logic of moral offsetting. Do something that looks ruthless and maybe even ugly in the short term, then overcorrect with philanthropy so massive it drowns out the harm. His story is one of equations swallowing ethics, of risk framed as duty. Because once you convince yourself that every extra million might be the difference between a lab stopping the next pandemic or failing to, caution starts to feel selfish. Finally, the decision crystallized. Jane Street could offer him a career. Crypto could offer him an empire. So he walked away. No grand farewell tour, just a young trader stepping into an airport with a laptop, a few colleagues, and a plan to exploit a glitch in the global financial system. As the plane lifted off, the guardrails of traditional finance fell away behind him, and ahead lay an unregulated frontier where, soon enough, customer money, political influence, and billions in invisible leverage would all collide. There was a time when the most profitable trade in crypto wasn't some exotic derivative or secret token. It was a simple price gap between two exchanges that almost no one could reliably capture. In 2017, as most people were just hearing the word Bitcoin, Sam Bankman-Fried was staring at a spreadsheet that looked less like a hobby and more like a printing press for money. Let me take you back to that moment. Bitcoin in the United States might be trading at, say, $10,000. In South Korea, where demand was exploding and capital controls were tight, the same Bitcoin could be selling for $12,000 or more. That spread became famous as the kimchi premium. In Japan, similar distortions appeared. To most traders, it was an interesting curiosity. To Sam, it was the foundation of an empire. The idea was brutally simple and brutally hard to execute. Buy Bitcoin where it was cheap, move it across borders faster than the market could adjust, and sell where it was expensive. Do it with size, do it with speed, and repeat until the window slammed shut. A single run might look like this. Wire dollars to a US exchange. Buy 1,000 Bitcoin at $10,000. Somehow get that Bitcoin onto a Korean or Japanese platform. Sell at $11,500 or $12,000. Then fight with banks and regulators to bring the proceeds back out. On paper, that's a $1.5 to $2 million gain in one loop. In practice, every step tried to kill the trade. To attack this problem, Sam founded Alameda Research. The name sounded like a sleepy quant lab, not a crypto hedge fund that would soon be shoving billions through fragile pipes. Inside, The life was anything but sleepy. EA-aligned friends, math Olympiad types, and idealists who believed they were earning to give crammed into shared apartments and makeshift offices. They slept in odd shifts, lived on takeout, and chased tiny basis points with the intensity most people reserve for family emergencies. Because of the chaos of early crypto, every victory came with a matching crisis. Banks froze accounts without warning. Compliance departments asked why millions were bouncing between Asia and obscure exchanges, and capital constraints meant missing one transfer window could erase an entire day's edge. There was always the fear that a single regulatory notice, a capital control tweak, or a sudden crash would close the kimchi premium overnight and strand their money in the wrong jurisdiction. Yet each time the machine worked, each time Alameda pulled millions from thin air, it rewired Sam's sense of what was possible. His story is one of compounding risk. Early on, when wires cleared and the team survived another week of improvisation, it felt at times inspiring and at times chilling. Alameda was trained in a world where rules were obstacles, not guardrails, and where aggressive leverage, secret side deals, and quick fixes were just tools of survival. It's an example of what happens when that culture of improvisation is later welded onto a customer-facing exchange that promises safety, stability, and trust. The arbitrage machine had been built. Next, it would be plugged directly into other people's money. The arbitrage machine had been built, but it needed a home, and in 2018 that home became a cramped, fluorescent box in Hong Kong. This was not the glamorous headquarters of a future crypto empire. It was a few rooms jammed with desks, monitors, extension cords, and a rotating cast of sleep-deprived 20-somethings trying to bend a 24/7 market to their will. There was a time when Alameda's office and apartment were the same address. Mattresses on the floor, clothes in piles, half-eaten takeout on the counter. People coded, traded, and argued within the same few meters of space. Sam often just collapsed on a beanbag near his desk, shoes still on, while order books flashed on giant screens through the night. Outside, Hong Kong neon pulsed. Inside, the only real clock was Bitcoin. Around-the-clock trading wasn't a slogan, it was a way of life. Phones were wired with alarms that screamed whenever a price moved more than a fraction of a percent. Slack never went quiet. Someone would close their eyes for 20 minutes and wake up to a dozen pings, 100 new messages, and the gnawing fear that $1 million spread had appeared and vanished while they dared to rest. Sleep became a negotiable expense, like office chairs or healthier food. In that pressure cooker, Sam's leadership style hardened. He spoke in probabilities, not feelings. A 5% chance of catastrophe was a rounding error. A trade that could lose everything but had a slightly higher expected value. To him, that was rational, even responsible. He was willing to take huge positions, to borrow aggressively, to lean the entire balance sheet into trades that made more cautious traders feel physically ill. To the team, it could feel detached, almost clinical. To Sam, it was just math. His story is one of translating that math into money at terrifying speed. When markets cooperated, the results were explosive. A risky cross-exchange bet would pay off, and suddenly, Alameda's account was up 8 figures. An obscure token mispriced on a sleepy exchange would be harvested for another quiet windfall. Each win whispered the same seductive message. This wasn't luck, this was skill. They weren't gambling, they were smarter than the rest of the world. Early success reinforced the most dangerous lesson in finance. If you bet big and survive, the risk disappears in the rearview mirror. Losses felt like flukes. Wins felt like destiny. It's an example of what happens when constant reinforcement collides with youth, leverage, and a market that mostly goes up. The wealth piling up in those Hong Kong accounts made the beanbags and instant noodles feel heroic, not reckless. But there was a structural problem quietly growing in the background. The more Alameda made, the more capital it needed to keep scaling the trades. Borrowing was expensive. Banks were wary. Other lenders wanted collateral and control. What Sam wanted was the opposite: stable, cheap, obedient capital that would never ask too many questions. And that desire would finally point him toward a much more ambitious idea. If the hedge fund could move markets, what kind of power would it have if it also owned the casino where everyone else came to play? There was a time when Alameda looked powerful from the outside. Tens of millions moving across exchanges, clever arbitrage, a young founder giving interviews about effective altruism and saving the world. But underneath the glossy story, the business model was fragile, wired with pressure points that never went away. Alameda did not own the casino. It was just another high-rolling customer. That meant dependence on external exchanges for everything that mattered: liquidity, leverage, even the simple ability to move money. When an opportunity appeared, they needed Binance, BitMEX, Huobi, whoever was on top that week, to actually let them trade. If those platforms changed a rule, tightened a risk limit, or delayed a withdrawal, the entire machine could seize up in an instant. Because of that dependence, counterparty risk was everywhere. Alameda might wire tens or hundreds of millions to an exchange in some offshore jurisdiction, hope the matching engine worked, hope the owners were honest, and hope no regulator showed up asking awkward questions. Every deposit was a bet that the venue wouldn't vanish overnight, get hacked, or quietly front-run their orders using the very data Alameda generated. And there was another problem. Banks hated this world. To a compliance officer in New York or Tokyo, a hedge fund shoveling money between opaque crypto exchanges in Hong Kong and the Bahamas looked less like innovation and more like a flashing red alarm. Accounts were closed, wires were delayed, leverage was rationed. Alameda's hunger was for cheap, flexible capital. What it got instead was expensive borrowing, margin calls, and a long line of traditional lenders saying no. So Sam started asking a different question. If every exchange was a potential threat, why not remove the threat? If the friction was withdrawal limits, risk controls, and someone else's compliance department, why not build a place where those limits, those controls, that compliance all answered to him? Let me take you back to that pivot, because this is where the empire really begins. The strategic insight was simple and at times inspiring and at times chilling. If you own the exchange, you do not just place trades. You set the rules of the game. You see the order flow before anyone else. You sit on top of the customer deposits, the leverage engine, the liquidations, the fees. A fragile trading shop can suddenly reposition itself as the center of the ecosystem, with money, data, and power all flowing through the same pipe. Pattern interrupt, cut to a courtroom years later. A prosecutor points at a chart and calls Alameda a slush fund for FTX, a vehicle used to spend customer money on risky bets, political donations, luxury real estate. The jury watches billions of vanished wealth reduced to colored boxes on a screen. Then snap back to that earlier moment when the idea was still clean in Sam's head. Alameda was trapped by other people's platforms. FTX would be the escape hatch, the funding source, and the control mechanism all in one. It's an example of what happens when a hedge fund stops trying to win the game and decides to quietly rewrite it instead. FTX was never just a website. It was a blueprint for a new kind of casino, one where the house could pretend it was your financial advisor. In 2019, while most of crypto still looked like a glitchy arcade run out of anonymous chat rooms, Sam and a small team quietly started building something else in a cramped office in Hong Kong. Let me take you back to that moment when the plan was simple: Design the most sophisticated derivatives exchange in the game, then make it feel so clean and safe that even cautious money would walk right in. There was a time when crypto trading meant laggy order books, random outages, and interfaces that looked like 1998 never ended. FTX went after a different crowd. It targeted the hedge funds, the prop traders, the offshore whales who wanted leverage, speed, and instruments that didn't exist anywhere else. Perpetual futures on obscure tokens, cross-margining, and 24/7 markets that never slept. The empire Sam wanted wasn't just big. It would sit at the center of the most aggressive, leverage flows in the entire industry. To pull that off, FTX wrapped danger in design. Leveraged tokens let users get 3x or more exposure without manually managing collateral. Perpetual futures let them bet on prices forever, no expiry, just rolling funding fees. On older exchanges, these were intimidating, almost hostile. On FTX, they were colorful tiles, intuitive sliders, tidy dashboards. Complex risk became a swipe and a click, efficient and at times inspiring and at times chilling, because the easier it felt, the more people pushed the limits. Branding did the rest. Where rivals crashed during volatility, FTX bragged about uptime. Where others looked like hacker dens, FTX pushed a clean UI, talk of compliance, and detailed risk controls. Auto liquidation engines, insurance funds, sophisticated margin systems. The message was simple. This is the grown-up room. Serious traders, serious controls, serious wealth. It's an example of what happens when a platform realizes that looking safer than everyone else can be more powerful than actually being safer. But beneath that polished surface, one design choice mattered more than any slogan. From day one, Alameda Research, Sam's hedge fund, was wired into the heart of FTX as a key market maker and liquidity provider. That meant tighter spreads, deeper order books, and a smooth trading experience. It also meant Alameda had special lanes in the system, informal priority, and a level of access no ordinary customer would ever see. Publicly, the two companies were separate. Privately, their life and money were already entangled in code and habit. The same architecture that let FTX auto-liquidate reckless traders in milliseconds could also let one favored account bend the rules in silence. And as deposits poured in and the exchange's valuation climbed into the tens of billions, that quiet advantage stopped being a technical detail and became a loaded weapon, one that would finally be used to move billions of customer dollars off the exchange without a single obvious alarm. That loaded weapon didn't stay in the shadows for long, but before it fired, FTX needed something more powerful than code. It needed trust. Not quiet, niche crypto forum trust, but mainstream, Super Bowl, your grandma has heard of it, trust. There was a time when the name FTX sat alongside blue-chip brands and hometown sports teams, and that was not an accident. Almost overnight, the logo was everywhere. On Formula One cars, on Major League Baseball umpire jerseys, splashed across esports tournaments and Twitch streams. The Miami Heat's arena was renamed FTX Arena in a $135 million deal, turning a speculative offshore exchange into a civic landmark. This was the empire building phase, not through refineries and railroads, but through naming rights, sponsorships, and a relentless social media presence that made the company feel edgy enough for crypto diehards, yet safe enough for cautious family money. At the center of it all stood Sam Bankman-Fried, looking like he had just rolled out of a dorm room, not a private jet. Disheveled hair, baggy t-shirt, cargo shorts, sleeping on beanbags in the office. The performance was surgical. He was presented as the anti-crypto bro, a math-obsessed MIT grad who talked about effective altruism, pandemic prevention, and giving away his wealth rather than flexing Lambos. His story is one of a young man who claimed to hate luxury, love spreadsheets, and treat money as a tool to fix the world. That image did something very specific. It lowered defenses. Because he talked about risk management and better markets, because he donated to political campaigns and pandemic research, because he framed his life as a sacrifice for a greater good, it became easier for investors and journalists to believe that this time, the brilliant quant was also the responsible adult in the room. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the contrast between the unkempt hoodie and the billions he controlled was exactly the point. Behind closed doors, the pitch to institutions turned the same narrative into glossy PowerPoint. Sequoia, SoftBank, Temasek, and others were shown risk dashboards, real-time liquidation engines, and language about segregation of customer funds. Compliance decks promised robust KYC, independent oversight, and a culture of prudence. Because of those reassurances, pension funds and endowments put money into a company that, on paper, looks safer than most of its rivals. But the safety was carefully framed. FTX's main exchange operated from the Bahamas, where the regulatory regime was more flexible, while a smaller FTX US arm sat under American rules. That split let the company talk about being regulated and responsible on stage, while the real action and the real leverage lived offshore. It's an example of what happens when jurisdiction shopping becomes a business model. And so, while celebrities told the public that FTX was the safest way to invest in crypto, while stadiums, streamers, and Super Bowl ads repeated the message, a hidden line of code was already rewriting what safe meant behind the scenes, quietly preparing the system to treat customer deposits as ammunition for someone else's bets. There was a time when the safest thing about crypto, at least on television, was Tom Brady's jawline. FTX didn't just buy ads, it bought a fantasy. In 2021, glossy commercials rolled out across prime time. America's most successful quarterback and his supermodel wife, Gisele Bündchen, dialing strangers, friends, former teammates, asking a simple question, "You in?" The lighting was warm, the banter effortless, the message unmistakable. This wasn't a fringe casino. This was family-friendly finance, as if joining FTX was like joining Brady's latest championship run. Let me take you back to those spots for a second. Brady leans over a bar counter, phone in hand, recruiting a bartender. Gisele calls her stylist. Neighbors, co-workers, regular people are pulled into the story, one by one, until it feels less like an ad and more like a movement. The subtext was powerful. If the man with 7 Super Bowl rings and the woman who had built a global fashion empire were putting their names, faces, and time into this thing, it had to be safe. Their life, their brand, their wealth were on the line, right? Then came Steph Curry. Different tone, same spell. In his campaign, the joke was that he wasn't a crypto expert. That was the hook. He looks at the camera, shrugs, and the narration reassures viewers that you don't need to be an expert either, because FTX has your back. It was at times inspiring and at times chilling, a world-class shooter known for impossible precision, telling millions that precision didn't really matter here. You didn't need to understand, you just needed to trust. Because of endorsements like this, skepticism suddenly looked uncool. If Brady, Gisele, and Curry, all surrounded by agents, lawyers, and financial advisors, were comfortable, then doubting FTX felt almost paranoid. It's an example of what happens when reputation is treated as collateral. Their faces became a kind of insurance policy in the public mind, a shield against the boring, ruthless questions that usually guard real money. And FTX didn't stop at people. It went after concrete, steel, and skyline. In 2021, the company signed a $135 million deal to slap its name on the Miami Heat's arena. Overnight, a major NBA venue turned into FTX Arena. Every televised game became a 3-hour billboard. Every highlight reel carried the logo. Every drone shot over Biscayne Bay stitched the brand into Miami's identity. There was a time when that building had hosted championship parades. Now it hosted a rising crypto empire, glowing blue in the humid night. From the outside, this was legitimacy on overdrive. Superstars on screen, a stadium in lights, politicians at ribbon cuttings, fans walking under the logo, on their way to see Jimmy Butler chase playoff glory. How bad could it really be if the city, the league, and the heroes of American sports had all signed on? Yet behind that halo, something else was taking shape. While Brady filmed call lists and the arena crew swapped out signage, Alameda's balance sheet was twisting, stretching, quietly filling with tokens that only made sense as long as no one pushed too hard. The lights on the arena blazed confidence into the night, even as, deep inside FTX's code and Alameda's spreadsheets, a structure was forming that could not survive a hard look, and soon someone was about to take one. While the arena lights screamed permanence, inside FTX a far quieter invention would matter much more than any billboard. A 3-letter token that turned marketing into money and then into a weapon. FTT was sold as the native blood of the empire, the loyalty card of a new financial world, and on paper, it looked harmless. There was a time when a token like this sounded almost boring. Hold FTT and you got trading fee discounts, VIP tiers, better withdrawal limits. Hold enough and you were promised a share of exchange revenues, buy and burn programs, the feeling that you weren't just a customer, you were part owner of the dream. For traders, it was a way to shave costs. For Sam's team, it was a way to print their own currency. The trick lay in what that currency represented. FTT's value was a bet on FTX's future volume, brand, and trustworthiness. As long as people believed the exchange was safe, FTT had value. As long as FTT had value, it made FTX look even more successful. The brand propped up the token, and the token propped up the brand, a neat reflexive loop where confidence became collateral, and collateral created more confidence. It's an example of what happens when belief itself becomes a line item. But belief was not where it stopped. Alameda and FTX didn't just hold FTT as a vanity chip. They pledged it. They took billions of dollars worth of a token they had created, largely controlled, and could not dump without destroying its price, and used it as collateral for loans. From lenders' perspective, there were assets on the other side. From the inside, they were borrowing real dollars against promises and thinly traded coins. Imagine opening a balance sheet and seeing billions under assets. Yet, when you read the fine print, it says FTT, SRM, and other illiquid tokens tied to the same small circle of entities. On one Alameda snapshot, more than half of the reported equity was FTT and related tokens, a pile of wealth that could only exist as long as no one tried to turn it into cash. Hard collateral, dollars, Bitcoin, liquid securities, was a much smaller slice, but the headline number looked impressive. Pattern interrupt. Jump forward to the leaked Alameda balance sheet in 2022, the one that showed the world just how much of Alameda's life depended on FTT. Traders saw that if FTT fell, Alameda's supposed cushion would evaporate. Panic followed almost instantly, then rewind, because the real story doesn't start with the leak. It starts the day FTT was conceived as collateral instead of just a loyalty token. From that moment, every new FTT issuance, every buy and burn, every press release about community quietly tightened the knot. The more FTT sat on those internal ledgers, the more tempting it became to lean on it. Loans were extended, risk piled up, and the empire's foundation shifted from cash and Bitcoin to its own reflection. On the surface, FTT made FTX look sophisticated, innovative, even generous. Underneath, it turned the balance sheet into a house of cards. All it would take was one strong gust of doubt for the whole structure to finally move. There was a time when FTX sold itself as the safe, grown-up place to trade crypto, with risk engines, liquidation bots, and complex safeguards humming in the background. What no one on the outside could see was that, buried inside that machinery, a few lines of code quietly told the system, the rules don't apply to Alameda. On a normal exchange, the story is simple. If a trader borrows too much, if their bets go bad, the system starts cutting them down. Positions are liquidated, collateral is seized, and the account is stopped long before it can run off with everyone else's money. That's how an empire built on leverage avoids instant ruin. Limits, checks, alarms. At FTX, those limits were real for millions of customers, but for Alameda, the internal system had been modified. In the database, Alameda's accounts were tagged in a special way, exempt from the usual risk checks. When the engine scanned for dangerous positions, it stepped around Alameda like a security guard, politely ignoring the owner's family. Let me take you back to the heart of it. A custom allow negative feature wired directly into FTX's core accounting. For ordinary users, going negative was impossible. The code would block withdrawals, trigger margin calls, and force liquidations. For Alameda, that same code contained an exception. It allowed their balance to plunge far below zero, to run a massive negative tab, without sounding the alarms that would have frozen anyone else in place. This wasn't a mysterious glitch, some tragic accident in a sea of numbers. Testimony from insiders and internal messages showed that senior leadership knew about the exemption and relied on it. When Alameda needed money, the back door opened. When lenders wanted their loans back, customer deposits quietly filled the gap. It was an example of what happens when power meets opacity and decides that rules are for other people. In a fair system, a losing Alameda trade would have been ruthlessly liquidated. The engine would sell its positions into the market, crystallize the loss, and protect the exchange. Instead, when Alameda's bets went bad, nothing visible happened. No forced sales, no public blow-ups, just an invisible number on an internal ledger sinking deeper into the red while the visible balances on customer screens stayed perfectly calm. Behind those screens, the reality was brutal. Alameda's negative balance was being patched with other people's deposits, turning user wealth into a private bailout fund. Every quiet loss in the hedge fund's life became an unseen hole in the exchange's balance sheet. And yet, from the outside, everything still looked safe. Celebrities smiled, ads promised security, deposits kept flowing. Each time a user clicked buy on a simple Bitcoin trade, a hidden line of code made a choice. Would that money remain where it appeared to be, or would it vanish into Alameda's black box, feeding a story that was at times inspiring and at times chilling and nowhere near finished? From that hidden line of code, let me take you back to where those choices were actually being made. A $40 million penthouse in the Bahamas, perched above turquoise water, wrapped in glass, and wired like a gamer's dream. Ocean on 3 sides, 10,000 square feet of marble and glass, and in the middle of it all, a cluster of desks and gaming chairs, glowing with multi-monitor setups, half trading floor, half college dorm. There was a time when the heart of this empire wasn't a boardroom or a Wall Street tower, but this apartment. Sam Bankman-Fried, his closest lieutenants from FTX and Alameda, and a rotating cast of engineers and quants lived, worked, and slept here. Whiteboards lined the walls, filled with equations, risk models, and half-erased strategy notes. Next to a scribbled formula about leverage, someone had drawn a cartoon. Next to a cartoon, a reminder to call a senator. Money, politics, and jokes sat inches apart. Inside, the dress code was permanent casual. T-shirts, gym shorts, bed hair at noon. Beanbags on the floor. Video game controllers tangled in charging cables. Takeout containers stacked beside laptops showing 9-figure account balances. Billions of dollars could move with a few keystrokes, yet the atmosphere felt closer to an all-night LAN party than a regulated financial institution. It's an example of what happens when enormous power lands in a room that still thinks it's cramming for finals. But the most unusual part wasn't the decor, it was the relationships. Multiple senior executives, including Sam, were reportedly entangled in overlapping romances, a tight polycule where dating lines, roommate lines, and reporting lines blurred together. The head of one division might be someone's manager, ex and landlord all at once. In that world, disagreeing with a trading strategy didn't just risk an awkward meeting, it threatened the entire social fabric of the home. Because of that, dissent inside the penthouse was rare. When everyone is sharing the same kitchen, the same bed, the same equity grants, and the same fantasy of world-changing wealth, groupthink hardens quickly. They convince themselves that traditional finance people didn't get it, that risk controls were for slower minds, that they alone were smart enough to bend the rules and catch the falling knife every time. His story is one of rationalization as much as innovation, at times inspiring and at times chilling. Outside, FTX ran Super Bowl ads and bought stadium naming rights. Inside, a tiny circle of 20-somethings sat barefoot at glowing keyboards, tabbing between League of Legends and trading screens. From this penthouse, with a few strokes of code, they could shift more money in an afternoon than most families on Earth would see in a lifetime. The real question was, what happened the day the screen started showing numbers that even this echo chamber could no longer explain? The numbers on those screens did not appear as rent payments, retirement accounts, or college savings. They appeared as variables, as expected value, as lines in a model that promised something grander than mere safety. In that room, the question was never, is this right? It was, does the upside justify the risk? There was a time when effective altruism sounded like the moral engine behind this entire empire. Earn as much money as possible, then give it away to save the world. On paper, it felt at times inspiring and at times chilling, because once the goal became maximizing impact in a cold mathematical sense, every trade, every shortcut, every gray area could be reframed as a lever in a grand equation. If a 1% chance of failure funded a 99% chance of helping humanity, then suddenly the difference between smart risk-taking and reckless gambling with other people's money did not feel so sharp. Inside FTX and Alameda, legal and ethical lines were not sacred boundaries. They were constraints, parameters to be optimized around. Compliance was something you routed through, not something you obeyed. Conversations, according to witnesses, sounded less like a business wrestling with duty and more like a hackathon. How to move money faster, how to bypass slow banks, how to structure entities so regulators in one country saw only a shadow of the real balance sheet. Let me take you back to those whiteboards. Diagrams of flows between FTX, Alameda, shell entities, and friendly market makers. Arrows looping, balances netting, liabilities renamed as loans or margin. A catastrophic scenario, an $8 billion hole if customers all withdrew at once, could be reduced to a small probability term in the corner. If that probability felt low enough, the enormous upside of growing to $1 trillion platform, of becoming the Rockefeller of crypto wealth, could be used to justify almost anything. Pattern interrupt. Cut away from the penthouse. A middle-aged man in a modest kitchen, phone in hand, refreshing an app. FTX balance, $216,000 yesterday. Today, 0, no equations, no expected value. Just the life savings of a family, erased between breakfast and lunch. Now cut back to the whiteboard where that same loss had once been a symbol, a Greek letter in a risk model. In that room, the language itself dulled the moral edge, cross-collateralized, auto-liquidation, exemptions, preferential margin. By wrapping simple ideas, borrowing customer deposits without permission, in dense technical language, even the people doing it could tell themselves they were engaged in innovation, not theft. Because of this culture of rationalization, worst-case outcomes became academic, a tail risk, a rounding error. And when a leader believes his story is one of saving the world with money and math, it's an example of what happens when power meets a narrative strong enough to explain away almost any line crossed. The next crack in that narrative would not appear on a whiteboard. It would appear on a leaked balance sheet. That leaked balance sheet didn't just rattle traders, it threatened a carefully constructed political image that had been years in the making. There was a time when, in Washington, Sam Bankman-Fried wasn't the villain of crypto. He was its golden boy, the earnest math nerd with wild hair and a checkbook big enough to make senators return his calls. In the span of a few election cycles, he went from anonymous quant to one of the largest political donors in America. Tens of millions of dollars flowed into campaigns and super PACs, officially branded as support for pandemic preparedness, effective policy, and safeguarding the future. The story was simple and comforting. A young billionaire using new money to prevent the next global catastrophe. It sounded noble. It also played extremely well on Capitol Hill. So let me take you back to those peak years when Sam seemed to live on a shuttle between the Bahamas and Washington, D.C. He testified before Congress about digital assets and consumer protection, gave calm, jargon-heavy answers, and apologized for the excesses of the industry he was supposedly trying to reform. He met with regulators behind closed doors, posed for photos with lawmakers, and cultivated the image of the good crypto billionaire who wanted rules, not loopholes. Compared to anonymous offshore exchanges and cartoon profile picture traders, he looked frankly safe. FTX and Sam leaned into that image with precision. They offered draft policy papers, technical briefings, and detailed flowcharts of how crypto markets worked. They framed FTX as a partner to regulators, not an adversary, promising real-time risk monitoring, transparent collateral, and innovative market structures. The proposals, of course, tended to favor the business model FTX already used, giving it a regulatory moat while competitors stayed in the gray zone. Because of his money, his access, and his fluency in the language of policy, that alignment was often framed as thought leadership, not self-interest. Later, after the crash, the public story of civic-minded giving began to crack. Bankruptcy filings and testimony revealed dark donations, routed through intermediaries and shell entities to influence both sides of the aisle. Publicly, he was a high-profile donor to causes coded as progressive. Privately, he was also funding conservative campaigns through back channels, aiming for quiet, bipartisan capture rather than loud partisanship. It was a strategy designed so that no matter who controlled the committees, someone would pick up the phone when FTX called. At times inspiring and at times chilling, his story is one of how quickly wealth can purchase proximity to power. While Sam was shaking hands in DC, assuring officials that his empire was building a safer financial future, internal spreadsheets were already tracking billions in liabilities. Numbers that no photo op, no white paper, and no speech could finally explain away. There was a time when every unbrushed curl on Sam's head and every wrinkled t-shirt on stage felt like proof that a new kind of billionaire had arrived. Not just rich, but righteous. Not just building an empire in crypto, but promising to give most of the money away. Major magazines rushed to crown him. Covers declared him the next Warren Buffett of crypto. Long profiles lingered on the beanbag on his office floor. The half-eaten vegan burritos. The idea that this awkward MIT math nerd was gaming markets by day and gaming utilitarian ethics by night. His story is one of calculated contrast. Enormous wealth paired with public vows to die with almost nothing. A trading powerhouse wrapped in the language of saving lives in distant countries. Let me take you back to those peak hype months. Journalists flew to the Bahamas and came home writing about the disheveled billionaire, who slept under his desk, who talked about pandemic preparedness and global poverty, while casually mentioning that FTX might one day handle all the money in the world. The tone was breathless, at times inspiring, and at times chilling, but the questions stayed soft. The myth of the benevolent genius was simply too good to ruin with due diligence. Investors followed the same script. Sequoia Capital published a now infamous essay about being mesmerized by Sam during a Zoom pitch, describing partners leaning in, captivated, while he played League of Legends mid-meeting. A man raising hundreds of millions while spamming hotkeys should have raised alarms about focus, discipline, risk. Instead, it was framed as endearing proof that his brain was operating on some higher frequency. Because of that framing, every obvious red flag became a quirky character trait. The messy hair meant he was too busy thinking about saving the world to find a comb. The cargo shorts on stage signaled authenticity, not immaturity. The video games during pitches suggested a mind so advanced it didn't need to give investors full attention. What might have looked like distraction or even contempt was repackaged as genius, and people with decades of experience in money and power nodded along. Underneath the aesthetic, the structure of his empire was dense, offshore, and opaque. Alameda Research in one jurisdiction, FTX in another, shell companies threaded through the Caribbean. Complex leverage, internal tokens, related party loans. In another era, that web would have triggered relentless investigation. Instead, much of the coverage waved it away as just how crypto works, as if opacity were a charming cultural quirk rather than a flashing siren. It's an example of what happens when narrative outruns numbers. By the time anyone asked how customer deposits flowed between entities, valuations had hit $32 billion. Celebrities were filming Super Bowl ads, and regulators were taking photo ops. The story had done its job. Then quietly, a single leaked balance sheet appeared. A few lines, some wonky acronyms, and a hole you could drive billions through. The myth of the benevolent genius was about to meet arithmetic, and the world was about to see what had really been funding Sam's empire. On the surface, it looked boring, safe, almost old-fashioned. You wired money in, you saw a balance, you traded a bit of crypto, and the exchange took a tiny fee. That was the promise, a clean, neutral marketplace where your dollars and coins sat in segregated accounts, ring-fenced from anyone else's problems, ready to withdraw at any time. There was a time when that was how exchanges were supposed to work. Your $10,000 arrives, it's credited to your name, and behind the scenes it should just sit there like a numbered box in a vault. FTX's job in this story was meant to be simple, match buyers and sellers, collect a few basis points, never touch the principal. No borrowing, no secret loans, no casino with customer money. Now let me take you back to what actually happened. In reality, many fiat deposits didn't go to FTX at all. They went to Alameda-controlled bank accounts because FTX itself struggled to get traditional banking. From the first wire, the line between exchange and hedge fund was blurred, then erased. On paper, the life of your deposit looked clean. In the real world, it entered a pool that Sam's other company could reach into. Picture a user wiring in $10,000. They buy $4,000 of Bitcoin, leave $6,000 in stablecoins, and log off, feeling prudent. On their dashboard, the numbers look solid. The colors are calm. The app congratulates them on their growing crypto wealth. But in the back-end ledger, that same balance is treated very differently. A hidden flag tells the system that Alameda can run a massive negative line of credit against the pooled pot that includes those funds. Because of a secret code path and special privileges, Alameda could do what no normal customer could. Go deeply negative, avoid liquidation, ignore basic risk limits. Losses on leverage trades, long-shot venture bets, political donations, luxury real estate for friends and family, all of it drew on a reservoir that included user deposits. It's an example of what happens when an empire of code is quietly rewritten to serve one favored player. Pattern interrupt, split the screen. On the left, a user sits at home, sipping coffee, glancing at an FTX portfolio that hasn't moved much overnight. No panic, no drama, just numbers on a screen. On the right, an internal chat window at 3 a.m., messages flying as employees scramble to find hundreds of millions to plug a liquidity hole, shuffling wallets, tapping the same pool of money the user thinks is untouched. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the engineering was elegant. Transfers were instant, balances updated smoothly. The illusion of safety never flickered. But beneath that polish, customer assets had been quietly transformed into unsecured loans to a failing hedge fund. The calm dashboard and the frantic Slack channel were the same story viewed from opposite sides, and the next chapter would show what happens when everyone tries to withdraw at once. The calm dashboard and the frantic Slack channel were the same story viewed from opposite sides, and behind both sat the same hungry engine, Alameda Research, running out of fuel. There was a time when Alameda was pitched as the smartest shop in crypto, a clean arbitrage machine quietly clipping pennies across exchanges. That version of the story did exist. It just didn't last very long. As the bull market roared into 2021, simple arbitrage felt small. Yield farms were promising triple-digit returns. New tokens launched every week. Venture rounds closed in hours. Alameda stopped being a careful market maker and started behaving like a sprawling crypto empire, taking directional bets on obscure coins, parking billions in illiquid DeFi pools, wiring money into private startup rounds that wouldn't unlock for years. Capital that once turned over in minutes was now trapped in projects with no exit, at prices that only made sense in a world where number always went up. To keep the music playing, they pulled the oldest lever in finance, leverage. Alameda pledged volatile tokens as collateral, borrowed against them, then used those loans to buy even more. FTT, Serum, Solana, random venture tokens from friends and family of the firm, all thrown into lending platforms as if they were blue-chip securities. On paper, the wealth looked enormous. In reality, it was like mortgaging a sandcastle during low tide. Because the market was euphoric, the danger stayed hidden. Token prices exploded, so margin calls never arrived. Lenders happily extended more credit. Interest rates in crypto were low, capital was cheap, and Alameda's balance sheet, swollen with its own FTT and thinly traded coins, appeared strong. It's an example of what happens when rising prices turn risk into an optical illusion. As long as the line went up, no one wanted to stare too hard at what was underneath. Inside, some people did stare. Internal spreadsheets showed huge, concentrated positions. Trial testimony later revealed Slack messages where executives warned that Alameda was levered long, everywhere, and one bad month from disaster. They knew a significant share of the collateral propping up those loans was FTT, a token largely created, controlled, and thinly floated by the same tiny circle of companies. They also knew something worse. Alameda's hole was being quietly stuffed with FTX customer money. Let me take you back to that hidden link. Alameda would lose on a directional bet, tap its special line of credit on FTX, and keep going. Losses on illiquid venture tokens were papered over with more borrowing. Yield farming positions that couldn't be unwound without crashing markets were left in place and financed with deposits from everyday users who thought they were just holding on an exchange. His story is one of leverage on leverage, risk stacked on risk, all balanced on the promise that withdrawals would never come all at once. When the broader crypto market finally cracked in 2022, that promise would shatter. Alameda's tower of leverage would not only wobble, it would topple straight into the pockets of millions of unsuspecting FTX customers, turning their savings into the first line of defense against a hedge fund's losing bets. When the ice finally cracked in 2022, it didn't start with FTX. It started with the climate around it changing. For years, there was a time when money was almost free, interest rates near zero, investors desperate for any story that promised growth, yield, or just a new buzzword. Tech soared, meme stocks exploded, and crypto looked less like a fringe experiment and more like the new Wall Street. Then central banks slammed on the brakes. Rates climbed. Suddenly, risk-free government bonds paid something again, and the world remembered that profits actually matter. Money flowed out of speculative assets. Tech sold off. Coins that had rocketed in 2021 began to slide. What had felt like an endless summer of wealth and easy power started to look more like a mirage, evaporating in slow motion. In that shifting landscape, the first huge fracture came from an unlikely place, an algorithmic stablecoin that promised perfect stability. Terra and its sister token Luna were designed as a closed loop of confidence, a machine that would hold $1 of value through clever code and circular incentives. When that confidence snapped in May 2022, the loop unraveled in days. Terra's stable coin lost its peg, Luna's price went into freefall, and tens of billions in paper wealth vanished almost overnight. The damage didn't stop with the people who held the tokens. Terra had been deeply woven into the crypto lending world. Hedge funds had borrowed against it. Platforms had offered double-digit yields on it. So when it blew up, margin calls hit, collateral evaporated, and forced liquidation started ripping through balance sheets. That's how the contagion reached one of the industry's most aggressive players, Three Arrows Capital. Three Arrows had built an empire of leverage, borrowing from every lender that would answer the phone, parking money on every platform that promised a slightly higher return. When Terra collapsed, their carefully constructed tower cracked. Soon they were defaulting on massive loans, leaving holes across exchanges, brokers, and lending desks. Voyager, Celsius, BlockFi, one after another, firms froze withdrawals, announced losses, or tumbled into bankruptcy. The crypto winter was no longer a metaphor. It felt like a blizzard. Into that blizzard stepped Sam Bankman-Fried. On Twitter, on conference stages, in late-night calls with panicked CEOs, he positioned FTX as the adult in the room. Let me take you back to those headlines. FTX extending a $250 million credit line here, offering to buy distressed assets there, talking about saving customers and protecting the ecosystem. His story is one of a self-styled savior racing from fire to fire with a hose made of other people's confidence. To the outside world, it was at times inspiring and at times chilling. Inspiring because someone appeared willing to put real money on the line to stop the bleeding. Chilling because it was a reminder of how concentrated the industry had become, how much power sat in the hands of a few 20-somethings in shorts and t-shirts. Yet every rescue had a hidden cost. When FTX lent to failing lenders, Alameda's exposure deepened. When it talked about acquiring bankrupt platforms, it was tying itself more tightly to loans that might never be repaid, to collateral that had already imploded. The more the broader market sank, the more FTX and Alameda were lashed to the wreckage, even as the marketing machine kept selling safety. Publicly, Sam was the White Knight. Privately, internal dashboards were flashing red. Liquidity was thinning, liabilities were mounting, and the neat story of a disciplined trading firm and a profitable exchange was starting to come apart under the weight of real numbers. On the surface, the winter made him look stronger than ever. Beneath the ice, something else was forming, a widening, silent fracture line that would, very soon, rip straight through the heart of his empire. On November the 2nd, 2022, that fracture line finally surfaced. Not in a courtroom, not in a regulator's memo, but in a single article on a crypto news site. CoinDesk had obtained a leaked internal balance sheet for Alameda Research, dated June 30th. And when they published its contents, the polished story of the disciplined trading firm and the safe, trusted exchange did not just crack, it shattered. Let me take you back to that document. On the surface, it looked like any other hedge fund snapshot. Columns of assets and liabilities, neat totals, a reassuring word at the bottom, solvent. But as reporters read through the numbers, something felt wrong. The assets were huge on paper, tens of billions, yet the quality of those assets, the real money behind the math, told a very different story. There was a time when everyone assumed Alameda was backed by cash, treasuries, maybe blue-chip crypto like Bitcoin and Ethereum. Instead, the leak showed a balance sheet dominated by FTT, the token created by FTX itself, along with other illiquid coins closely tied to Sam's own empire. Serum, MAPS, OXY, and a grab bag of tokens that barely traded. Alameda's single largest line item? More than $3 billion of unlocked FTT, plus billions more in collateral and locked positions that could not be sold without detonating the market. Freeze frame there. The camera lands on one line, FTT, $3,660,000. The numbers sit in black and white. Then the frame pulls back, zooming out from the spreadsheet into a spinning globe, lighting up dots across the United States, Europe, Asia, Africa, Latin America. Those numbers are not backed by some distant pool of corporate wealth. They are implicitly resting on the deposits of millions of ordinary users who believed their money was safely parked on FTX. Because Alameda's solvency depended on tokens it and FTX effectively controlled, the whole structure was at times inspiring and at times chilling. On the way up, printing a token, using it as collateral, and borrowing against it looked like genius. But it was also a textbook example of what happens when self-issued chips are treated as real collateral. Any hit to confidence could trigger a death loop. If FTT fell, Alameda's assets would plunge, lenders would demand repayment, forced selling would push FTT lower, and the spiral would feed on itself. Traders understood this instantly. Competitors who had once envied Sam's rise now saw something else. A fragile, incestuous relationship between Alameda and FTX, where the trading firm's balance sheet was propped up by the exchange's own token, and the exchange's reputation was, in turn, propped up by Alameda's supposed success. His story is one of leverage, self-reference, and a ruthless disregard for boring safeguards. Within hours of the article, group chats lit up, risk desks ran the numbers, and one question spread through the market. If this is what leaked, what did the private sheets look like? The answer would come quickly from an unexpected source, and it would turn a troubling article into a full-scale run on Sam's empire. The answer did not come from a regulator, an auditor, or a whistleblower. It came from the one person in crypto who could move billions with a sentence, Changpeng Zhao, better known as CZ. If Sam was the golden boy, CZ was the cold operator. Founder of Binance, the largest exchange on the planet, he controlled an empire of trading volume, derivatives, and influence that dwarfed FTX. There was a time when the market treated them as twin pillars of a new financial world, rivals in public but bound by money in private. In FTX's early days, Binance had even been an investor, receiving a huge pile of FTT tokens when it exited the deal. Those tokens were supposed to be harmless, treasury decoration, a sign of shared wealth between two giants. Instead, they became the match. Because when the balance sheet leak raised questions about FTT, everyone quietly wondered what Binance would do with its stash. For a day or two, nothing happened. Then CZ opened Twitter. He posted that, due to recent revelations, Binance would liquidate its remaining FTT holdings. He framed it as risk management, a prudent step any responsible firm would take. No drama, just caution. But markets don't hear tone, they hear hierarchy. And when the biggest exchange on Earth announces it no longer wants to hold your token, the message is simple. The insider with the deepest information no longer trusts the collateral or the balance sheet behind it. Crypto Twitter did the rest. Influencers dissected every word, traders posted on-chain screenshots, and memes compared FTT to collapsing altcoins of previous cycles. It was, at times inspiring and at times chilling, how fast the narrative flipped. One weekend, FTX was the safe, regulated venue for serious money. The next, it was a question mark with a ticking clock over its logo. Prices moved first. FTT began to slide, then plunge, as holders rushed to exit before Binance finished selling. That falling price didn't just hurt optics, it attacked the core of Sam's empire, because so much of Alameda and FTX's reported wealth was tied to that token. As FTT sank, the implied value of their balance sheet evaporated on public charts, in real time, for everyone to see. Then came the withdrawals. Traders pulled funds from FTX at a pace that looked less like normal risk management and more like a classic bank run. On-chain data showed billions leaving the exchange in a matter of days, then hours, as market makers, hedge funds, and retail users all raced each other to the door. Let me take you back to traditional banking for a moment. When a run starts there, regulators can step in, pause withdrawals, flood the system with emergency liquidity. In crypto, there was no circuit breaker, no adult supervision, only code and confidence. Once that confidence snapped, the race was on, and underneath FTX's glossy marketing lay a hidden hole that could not withstand the stampede. His story is one of leverage, but here the leverage finally pulled back. Once confidence snapped, the race became a stampede. Not only were traders nervous, they were terrified. And in crypto, that means one thing: everyone rushes for the exit at the same time. There was a time when logging into FTX felt like opening a sleek, well-oiled machine. Orders filled instantly, balances updated in a blink, withdrawals hit bank accounts in hours. Now, in early November 2022, users opened the same app and saw something very different: withdrawal pending, withdrawal delayed, withdrawal stuck. On-chain, analysts watched tens of thousands of coins pour out of FTX's wallets in real time, like a digital bank run playing out on an open ledger. The trigger had been simple. A leaked Alameda balance sheet suggested that much of its supposed wealth was just FTT, the exchange's own token. Then CZ, the man behind Binance and Sam's biggest rival, announced he would liquidate Binance's FTT holdings. Cause, effect, moral color, one tweet, billions in value erased, and a story of borrowed power suddenly exposed. Customers who had once trusted the branding, the celebrities, the arena naming rights, now did the only rational thing left. They tried to pull their money. Publicly, FTX moved fast to Project Calm. The official account tweeted that assets are fine. Sam echoed it, insisting withdrawals were being processed, that any backlog was only operational, not a sign of insolvency. It was the digital equivalent of a bank manager standing in front of a crowd saying, "There is no problem here. Please form an orderly line." Behind the scenes, there was no orderly line, only chaos. Executives dug through internal dashboards and finally saw the true size of the hole. Not millions, but billions missing from customer accounts. His story is one of leverage and speed, but now leverage had turned into a trap. They called investors, sovereign wealth funds, rival exchanges. They talked about emergency lines of credit, bridge financing, anything that might plug an $8 to $10 billion gap that had opened like a sinkhole under their empire. As hours passed, the contradiction between the tweets and reality widened. On-chain data showed FTX's hot wallets draining to almost nothing. Users posted screenshots of frozen withdrawals, support tickets unanswered, balances that existed on the screen but refused to move. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the transparency of blockchain turned into a live autopsy. The market watched the patient bleed out while the official account kept insisting that the pulse was strong. It's an example of what happens when a platform built on confidence loses it in a single weekend. Finally, with options evaporating and the bank run still accelerating, Sam reached for a move that stunned even insiders. Let me take you back to that moment. The golden boy of crypto, cornered, picked up the phone and turned to the very rival who had lit the match, offering to sell FTX to Binance in a last, desperate bid to keep the life of his empire from ending overnight. For a few surreal hours, it looked like the empire might be saved. The same rival who had triggered the bank run stepped forward as a potential savior, and in a market driven by sentiment and screens, that single headline was enough to slow the panic. There was a time when one tweet could add billions in paper wealth or erase it overnight. This was one of those moments. Sam and Changpeng Zhao, CZ, announced that Binance had signed a non-binding letter of intent to acquire FTX, subject to due diligence. Non-binding or not, traders saw only one thing. The largest exchange on Earth might absorb the wounded golden boy. Charts flickered green, FTT bounced. Some customers even paused withdrawals, clinging to the idea that the life of this once invincible platform might finally be extended. But a letter of intent is not a rescue, it is a question mark. And Binance, unlike the influencers and celebrities who had praised FTX without asking too many questions, now had permission to look behind the curtain. Let me take you back to that due diligence window. Binance's team gained access to internal financials, liquidity reports, and the tangled web connecting FTX to Alameda research. Balance sheets that had been massaged for investors suddenly had to withstand scrutiny from a ruthless competitor. Lawyers pored over potential regulatory exposure in the United States and abroad, asking what exactly had been promised to customers and what had been done with their money instead. What they found was not a temporary liquidity squeeze, it was a hole. Reports later described an $8 to $10 billion shortfall in customer assets, a negative balance that could not be waved away by market volatility or clever accounting. On top of that came whispers of a secret code in FTX's systems, special exemptions, customer deposits wired into a hedge fund casino. This was not just a distressed asset, it was a crime scene waiting for yellow tape. Because of that, Binance moved just as fast in reverse. Within roughly a day, the company announced it would not pursue the acquisition, citing corporate due diligence, reports of mishandled funds, and looming regulatory investigations that were beyond their ability to help. When the biggest player in crypto with full access to the books refused to touch FTX, the message to the market was brutal. Pattern interrupt. Cut the triumphant Binance to the rescue headline. Smashed to a gray PDF on a courtroom docket in RE FTX trading letiede dead or. The story flipped from bailout fantasy to bankruptcy reality in less than 48 hours. From that point, confidence did not just weaken, it evaporated. Customers understood that if Binance would not backstop this collapse, no one else could. It is an example of what happens when an empire built on leverage, image, and borrowed trust finally runs out of believers. The next chapter would not be about rescue at all, but about the forensic task of counting what was left and who, if anyone, would ever be made whole. When belief finally vanished, something even more brutal took its place: paperwork. Not tweets, not term sheets, but the cold, legal language of collapse. On November 11, 2022, FTX Trading, FTX US, Alameda Research, and more than 100 related entities all filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the United States. In one morning, an empire that had once been valued at $32 billion officially admitted it could not pay its bills. There was a time when the FTX family was sold as a sleek, unified machine. Now that same family appeared in court documents as a tangled list of code names and shell companies stretching across jurisdictions. The filing covered exchanges, market makers, venture arms, and obscure vehicles no customer had ever heard of. It was a map of how far the reach had gone, and how little anyone outside the inner circle had truly understood about where the money actually lived. Into this wreckage stepped a man whose career was built on financial disaster. The new CEO, appointed the same day, was John J. Ray III, the restructuring expert who had overseen Enron's unwinding. Not only was he the person called in for some of the ugliest corporate failures in modern history, he was now saying that what he found at FTX was worse. In his first court filings, Ray wrote that he had never seen such a complete failure of corporate controls and such a complete absence of trustworthy financial information. Coming from the man who had read Enron's books line by line, that was not comforting. On the ground, the impact was immediate and ruthless. Trading halted. Withdrawals froze. Millions of customers, from small retail traders to professional funds, opened their apps and saw balances they could not touch, with no clear path to recovery. Some had parked life savings on the exchange, lulled by Super Bowl ads and celebrity faces into believing this was the safe on-ramp to crypto wealth. Now their accounts were numbers on a screen inside a bankruptcy estate. Markets reacted like a nervous system hit with an electric shock. Crypto prices plunged as fear rippled outward. Exchanges scrambled to issue proof of reserves reports. Lenders quietly admitted they had lent billions to Alameda or held FTT as collateral. A few tried to sound calm while racing to plug their own holes. Regulators from the Bahamas to the United States to Europe announced investigations, hearings, emergency task forces. It was an example of what happens when a single failure exposes how interconnected and fragile the entire system has become. Yet the real story was only beginning. As lawyers, regulators, and forensic accountants started digging through FTX's records, they did not just find sloppiness or youthful chaos. They uncovered code, side agreements, and internal systems that seemed designed to blur, if not hide, the trail of money. The question was no longer just how much had vanished, but whether the empire had been engineered from the start to make sure no one could easily trace where it went. When the empire finally collapsed and the smoke cleared, a different kind of character walked into the ruins. Not a crypto visionary in a t-shirt, but a bankruptcy veteran in a suit, John J. Ray III, the man who had once helped pick through the carcass of Enron. He opened the books at FTX, looked around, and then wrote a sentence that stunned even hardened Wall Street lawyers. He said he had never seen such a complete failure of corporate controls and such a complete absence of trustworthy financial information in his entire career, including at Enron. That line matters, because there was a time when Enron was the gold standard of corporate fraud, the cautionary tale taught in business schools. Now, FTX had managed to look worse. Let me take you back to those first days in November 2022, as Ray's team tried to understand what this thing actually was. They expected ledgers, reconciliations, a clear map of where customer money sat. Instead, they found missing or unreliable financial records, half-finished spreadsheets, and internal balance sheets that contradicted each other. Key decisions had been made not in boardrooms with minutes, but in chat apps with auto-deleting messages, as if the company's memory was designed to erase itself every few days. Inside, the lines between FTX and Alameda Research barely existed. Employees described the hedge fund and the exchange as one blended operation, sharing office space, sharing systems, sharing decisions. In practice, that meant billions in customer funds were commingled with corporate and trading accounts. Deposits that users thought were safely parked on an exchange were quietly routed into a private hedge fund casino, with minimal documentation of loans, transfers, or any rational explanation for why the money moved when it did. His story is one of frictionless power inside the walls and almost no friction on paper. Loans to executives, sometimes in the billions, were memorialized with the same casual tone someone might use to Venmo a friend for lunch. Assets were tracked on informal spreadsheets, with names that sounded more like personal to-do lists than the backbone of a $32 billion valuation. Corporate expenses could be approved with a single emoji reaction in a group chat. Thumbs up, billions out the door. It's an example of what happens when wealth, hype, and a cult of genius override the boring disciplines that keep other people's money safe. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the public image had been one of effective altruism, regulation, and safety. Inside the life of the company, what Ray saw looked closer to organized chaos held together by trust in one man and a shared belief that the numbers would always go up. While Ray's team tried to reconstruct the past line by line, Sam Bankman-Fried was already doing something else entirely. From a luxury house in the Bahamas, and then from his parents' home in California, he launched his own media tour, appearing on live streams, podcasts, and conference stages trying to rewrite the story in real time. The ruins were still smoking, and yet the main character had already stepped back on stage, ready with a new script. There was a time when fallen titans disappeared behind law firms and press releases. Sam did the opposite. Days after the collapse, while lawyers begged for silence, he was logging into Twitter Spaces at 2 a.m., calling into podcasts, and sitting for televised interviews from his parents' comfortable home in Palo Alto, framed by bookshelves and suburban calm, explaining how an $8 billion hole had suddenly appeared. On screen, he slouched in a t-shirt, hair uncombed, voice flat. The empire was gone, the money vaporized, but the performance was strangely casual. He told Andrew Ross Sorkin at the New York Times Dealbook Summit that he had screwed up, that he had been overconfident and careless, that FTX had been over-leveraged and poorly risk-managed. Over and over, he insisted he never meant to hurt customers, never knowingly committed fraud, never directed a theft. The story was one of tragic incompetence, not ruthless deception. He repeated the same lines on YouTube shows, on crypto podcasts, on marathon Twitter spaces where thousands listen live. He talked about bad dashboards, messy accounting, a failure to track positions. He described Alameda as just another large user on the platform and framed the whole disaster as a chaotic blur where numbers move too fast for any one person to grasp. To many viewers, it sounded like a burned-out founder drowning in complexity. But let me take you back to what investigators were uncovering at the same time. FTX's code contained a special exemption for Alameda, a hidden backdoor that allowed it to run a multi-billion-dollar negative balance without triggering liquidation. Alameda enjoyed effectively infinite credit, while ordinary customers were liquidated in minutes. Internal spreadsheets showed customer deposits wired straight into Alameda's accounts. Executives were chatting in Signal about our borrowed customer funds, about plugging an $8 billion hole. Now, cut the scene. On one side, Sam on a live stream, calmly explaining that he thought Alameda's margin was a little bit higher than he realized. On the other, a courtroom sketch, him in a suit at the defense table, jaw tight, eyes down. Then another cut, this time to a victim reading a statement about retirement savings gone, about a family home sold, about plans for children erased in a weekend. The tone is soft on YouTube. The stakes are life-altering on paper. Public reaction split along that fault line. Some saw a remorseful, overwhelmed young man, a math nerd who let risks spiral beyond his control, at times inspiring and at times chilling in his apparent honesty. Others saw something colder, a deliberate attempt to rebrand calculated decisions as innocent mistakes, to get ahead of witnesses and documents by planting a narrative in the public mind. Because of those interviews, prosecutors would later have a treasure trove of on-camera contradictions. And as the criminal case moved forward, the gap between Sam's late-night explanations and the hard evidence would only grow wider. Those late-night interviews were still bouncing around the internet when the real plot twist arrived. On the evening of December 12th, 2022, as Sam refreshed his inbox in a Nassau penthouse, Bahamian police walked through the door with an arrest warrant requested by the United States. There was a time when he summoned presidents and former prime ministers to his conference stage. Now he was being led out in handcuffs, hours before he was scheduled to testify before Congress via video. The golden boy of crypto, who had spent weeks telling anyone who would listen that this was just a liquidity crisis, was suddenly facing the one audience he could not charm: federal prosecutors. In New York, those prosecutors had moved fast. A grand jury indictment laid out 8 criminal counts: wire fraud on FTX customers, wire fraud on Alameda's lenders, conspiracy to commit both, securities fraud, commodities fraud, and money laundering conspiracy. The story was no longer about a blown-up exchange. It was about an alleged scheme to steal billions in customer money, move it through shell entities, political donations, and real estate deals, and then lie about it on national television. Because of that alleged scheme, the tone shifted from chaotic corporate collapse to something at times inspiring and at times chilling about the reach of the American legal system. Bahamian authorities transferred Sam from the penthouse to Fox Hill Prison, a facility long criticized for overcrowding, vermin, and poor sanitation. For a man who had once talked about giving away his wealth to save the world, the new mission was more modest. Avoid the rats, get through the night, talk to his lawyers. His story is one of sudden reversals. Just weeks earlier, he had been fielding calls from investors and celebrities. Now the calls were about extradition treaties and sentencing guidelines. At first, his legal team in the Bahamas signaled a fight, raising questions about due process and the speed of the U.S. case. Then, in a pattern interrupt that surprised even close observers, Sam abruptly waived his extradition challenge and agreed to be flown to New York. When he landed, the empire he had built on leverage and confidence was gone, but the machinery of American justice was only getting started. He was brought into federal court in Manhattan, entered a not guilty plea, and heard the charges read in a packed courtroom where the spectators included burned investors and curious onlookers who had once seen his life through glossy magazine profiles. Despite the scale of the alleged fraud, the judge granted bail, a $250 million recognizance bond secured by his parents' Palo Alto home and co-signed by family friends. The conditions were harsh in their own way. House arrest at his parents' place near Stanford, an ankle monitor, restricted internet, no running a new crypto platform from the kitchen table. Let me take you back to that quiet California neighborhood for a moment, because it's an example of what happens when money, power, and loyalty collide. While Sam paced the backyard, rehearsing his defense, his closest allies were walking into prosecutor offices, signing cooperation agreements, and preparing to testify against him. While Sam paced that backyard in California, trying to hold his crumbling empire together with talking points and optimism, another story was unfolding in quiet federal conference rooms. The life rafts were being handed out, and they weren't going to him. There was a time when Caroline Ellison was introduced as the prodigy running Alameda Research, a shy MIT mathlete who somehow ended up managing tens of billions for one of crypto's most powerful families of companies. She was also Sam's on and off romantic partner, living in the same Bahamas penthouse, sharing the same tiny circle of trust. Now, let me take you back to December 2022, when she walked into a Manhattan courtroom and did something unthinkable for that loyal inner circle. She pled guilty to fraud and conspiracy and agreed to cooperate. Her story is one of proximity to power turning into proximity to criminal liability. In her plea, she admitted that Alameda had been quietly taking FTX customer money, that the hedge fund had a special line of credit worth billions, and that the whole arrangement was hidden from lenders, investors, and the public. She acknowledged preparing balance sheets that made Alameda look safer than it was, smoothing over the gaping hole where customer deposits were supposed to be. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the math whiz who once wrote trading algorithms was now quantifying the fraud for prosecutors. She wasn't alone. FTX co-founder Gary Wang, the quiet coder who had been with Sam since MIT, also pled guilty. So did Nishad Singh, the engineering director who helped build the exchange's core systems and join the wave of political donations that bought access in Washington. Each man admitted that the code was not neutral, that there was a backdoor in FTX's engine, which let Alameda run a massive negative balance without being liquidated. Customer collateral was treated not as sacred, but as a convenient funding source. Because of their guilty pleas, the government's narrative stopped being theoretical. Caroline said she knew it was wrong and did it anyway. Gary admitted he wrote the special code that privileged Alameda. Nishad described how internal risk dashboards were designed to hide the true exposure. Together, they painted a picture of deliberate misrepresentations to lenders, investors, and millions of users who had been told FTX was safe, regulated, and backed one-to-one. That transformed the case. This was no longer a battle of dueling experts arguing over spreadsheets and market volatility. It was an example of what happens when the people at the very center of power turn around, raise their right hands, and testify under oath that the whole thing was built on lies. The defense could talk about chaos, about rapid growth, about unfortunate mistakes. The prosecution could point to 3 insiders saying, in effect, we knew. And now, with his CEO, his co-founder, and his head of engineering all seated at the government's table, Sam Bankman-Fried was walking toward a trial where the story of FTX and Alameda would be told by the only people who had been in the room for every crucial decision. The question was no longer what happened inside FTX. The question was how much they were willing to reveal about the man who led them. When the trial finally opened, prosecutors didn't describe a quirky math genius who flew too close to the sun. They described an architect, a man who spent years quietly rewiring a global crypto empire so that customer money flowed one way, straight into Alameda, straight into influence, straight into his own life. Their overarching theory was simple and brutal. FTX was not an exchange that collapsed. It was a fraud that succeeded until it didn't. Because of deliberate choices, secret code, and a pattern of lies, billions that were supposed to sit safely on a platform became the personal piggy bank of its founder, his friends, and his hedge fund. To make that story real, the government brought in the people who had helped build it. There was a time when Caroline Ellison, Gary Wang, and Nishad Singh were seen as the loyal inner circle, the brain trust behind the scenes. On the stand, they became tour guides through the crime scene. Step by step, they walked the jury through decisions, the creation of a special allow negative feature in the code, the approval of limitless credit for Alameda, the moment they agreed to send doctored balance sheets to lenders who were asking too many questions. Caroline described spreadsheets that showed an 8 billion dealer hole, then showed the cleaned-up versions sent to creditors. Gary explained how a few extra lines of code let Alameda run a multi-billion-dollar negative balance, while ordinary users would be liquidated for a tiny margin call. Nishad talked about late-night meetings in the Bahamas, where everyone knew the numbers didn't add up. But the spending on real estate, donations, and marketing went on anyway. The defense tried to paint chaos and negligence. The prosecutors answered with receipts, internal signal chats where executives joked about FTX user deposits, being used to pay for all the things, code comments tying specific changes to Sam's directions, emails and Google Docs where risk warnings were crossed out, leverage limits were raised, and the words, "Do not send this version," sat next to the real balance sheet. Then came the people on the other side of the screen. Let me take you back to one of the government's sharpest choices. For a moment, the story left the polished wood of the courtroom. A victim's testimony described waking up in a small apartment, opening the FTX app, and watching a 6-figure balance flicker to zero. A retirement fund, a child's college money, years of disciplined saving, gone in a loading animation. Cut back to the courtroom. The prosecutor pointed across the room, past the lawyers and the cameras, to the man at the defense table. This, they said, was not about sophisticated traders who should have known better. It was about ordinary families, about trust sold with Super Bowl ads and stadium naming rights, about what happens when one person is given godlike power over other people's wealth. His story is one of meteoric rise and catastrophic fall, at times inspiring and at times chilling. And as the government finished its case, the question hanging in the air was no longer whether there had been a crime, but how a 30-year-old founder had convinced almost everyone on Earth that the house of cards was solid rock. So when it was finally the defense's turn, the story on display shifted. Not from disaster to success, that ship had sunk, but from villainy to something far more mundane. A young founder drowning in his own empire, making terrible decisions with other people's money, and never quite understanding how close he was to the edge. Their central claim was simple and repeated like a drumbeat. Sam was reckless, not ruthless. He grew too fast, trusted the wrong people, failed to build real risk controls, and misread the markets. But, they insisted, he never woke up in that penthouse and said, "Today, let's defraud millions of customers." In their telling, his life was not a heist movie. It was a blown-up startup. To make that work, they had to reframe the most damning fact in the case: the missing billions in customer funds. Prosecutors called it theft. The defense called it a misunderstood margin system. There was a time when margin trading had been sold as one of FTX's core features, and the lawyers leaned on that. They argued that customers who opted into margin knew their balances, could be lent, rehypothecated, sloshed around the internal pool like any aggressive brokerage. The problem, they said, was not secret stealing, but chaotic, poorly documented lending. Alameda's bottomless credit line, the secret code that let it go deeply negative, the special exemptions from liquidation, these were not, in their framing, a hidden tunnel. They were a clumsy attempt to implement a house margin account for the market-making firm that kept the exchange liquid. Badly designed, disastrously supervised, but not, they said, a criminal conspiracy. It's an example of what happens when brilliant quants decide they can improvise a bank without reading the rulebook. Then came the attack on the cooperating witnesses: Carolyn Ellison, Gary Wang, Nishad Singh, the former inner circle now sitting on the other side of the courtroom. The defense suggested they had found a convenient villain in their old boss. Each had signed cooperation deals. Each was facing decades in prison. Because of that, the defense argued their memories had become suspiciously aligned with the government's theory, their own power and wealth protected as long as they pointed the finger in the right direction. And then, in a move most white-collar defendants avoid, Sam himself took the stand. Let me take you back to that moment. The hoodie was gone, replaced by a suit, a little too big, like the power had been stripped away, but the outline remained. He spoke quickly, sometimes too quickly, about risk engines, auto-liquidation, cross-collateral. He told the jury he believed Alameda's borrowing was allowed, that lawyers had blessed the structure, that he thought the money would come back when the markets recovered. His story is one of misplaced faith in models, in endless bull markets, in his own ability to plug an $8 billion hole with one more deal. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the defense asked the jury to see a gambler who lost, not a thief who planned. Because in the end, the question wasn't whether FTX was a disaster. Everyone in that room knew it was. The real question was far sharper. Was this catastrophe accidental, or was it engineered from the start? In the end, that sharp question wasn't answered by lawyers or headlines. It was answered by 12 strangers filing back into a silent New York courtroom, eyes fixed forward, faces unreadable. There was a time when Sam Bankman-Fried commanded arenas and Super Bowl airtime. Now, every inch of that room belonged to the jury foreperson holding a single sheet of paper. The air felt heavy, no buzzing phones, no clicking keyboards, just the rustle of people standing as the jury entered. Sam stared at the table, jaw tight, a former crypto emperor reduced to a defendant in an ill-fitting suit. Behind him, former FTX customers, some who had lost life savings, leaned in so far it looked like they were afraid to miss a single word. The judge asked the question that would decide the next chapter of his life. Had the jury reached a verdict? They had. On the first count, wire fraud on FTX customers, guilty. The story of safe accounts and segregated funds was dead in a single syllable. On wire fraud against Alameda lenders, guilty. The fantasy that sophisticated institutions knew the risks and weren't really deceived did not survive contact with the evidence. Conspiracy to commit wire fraud on FTX customers and on Alameda lenders, guilty, guilty. The idea that this was just chaos, not coordination, evaporated. Then came the market-facing charges. Conspiracy to commit securities fraud against FTX equity investors, guilty. Conspiracy to commit commodities fraud on FTX customers trading crypto derivatives, guilty. Conspiracy to commit money laundering, moving misappropriated customer money through a maze of accounts and entities, guilty. 7 counts, 7 unanimous verdicts, not a single holdout willing to say this was merely incompetence. That unanimity mattered. It meant the jury had heard the story of the math nerd who got in over his head and rejected it. They had watched former friends describe secret code that let Alameda run a multi-billion-dollar negative balance, saw balance sheets with an $8 billion crater where customer money should have been, and concluded this was engineered. His story is one of ambition, yes, but also of deliberate choices that crossed the line from risky to criminal. Prosecutors sat almost motionless, the stillness of people who know they have just won the case of their careers. Defense attorneys looked stunned, then professional, then quietly devastated, already thinking about appeals. In the gallery, one victim wiped away tears of relief. Another shook their head, whispering that a verdict wouldn't refill an empty account. Wealth had vanished. The law could punish, but it could not reprint lost years of work. Because that was the twist. Legal accountability arrived faster than anyone expected, but the money was still missing, tangled in bankruptcy proceedings and clawbacks that might take a decade. It's an example of what happens when hype, leverage, and blind trust build an empire on sand. The fall is quick, the cleanup is slow. The courtroom chapter was finally closed on one question: was he guilty? But another, darker question now loomed over the entire industry. How far would the judge go in sentencing, and what kind of message would that send to every other visionary still playing with other people's money? So let me take you back to that final act in the same building where presidents have been arraigned and mob bosses sentenced. The verdict is in, the headlines have cooled a little, but now comes the number that will follow him for the rest of his life. 25 years. Not in a Bahamas penthouse, not on a beanbag in a Hong Kong office, but in federal prison. The sentencing hearing feels less like a tech conference and more like a reckoning. Prosecutors stand up first. They walk the judge through the wreckage. Billions in customer money diverted. An $8 billion black hole. Retirees wiped out. Small traders who thought FTX was the safest way to invest in crypto, now back in poverty or close to it. They argue this was no accident of volatility, but a deliberate scheme, run over years, hidden with secret code and fake balance sheets. They ask for a term that sounds almost geological, stressing deterrence, public trust, and the sheer scale of the empire he built on lies. Then the tone shifts. Defense lawyers talk about his age, his lack of prior record, his supposed intention to make customers whole. They describe a brilliant but socially awkward math nerd, a devoted son from a respected academic family, someone whose life spiraled out of control when the markets turned. They present letters begging for mercy, pointing to his donations, his talk of effective altruism, the image of a young man who, if given enough time, might contribute something good again. Victims speak, too. There was a time when many of them believed every glossy ad. One lost college savings, another lost a family home, another watched a small business crumble when funds locked on FTX never came back. Their stories are quiet, not theatrical, and that quiet is what lands. The judge listens, takes notes, and then finally speaks. His reasoning is blunt. This is not a crime of bad luck, he says, but of choices. The harm is massive, the deception sustained, the remorse limited. He points to Sam's media appearances, his post-collapse interviews, his tendency to explain rather than to truly apologize. Deterrence matters. If the sentence is light, every ambitious founder playing with customer deposits will hear it as permission. 25 years, the judge explains, balances his age with the need to send a warning shot across the entire industry. In the history of white-collar crime, the number is telling. It is shorter than Bernie Madoff's 150-year symbolic wall, longer than many insider trading or accounting fraud cases, and far harsher than the gentle taps executives once expected when money moved in spreadsheets instead of duffel bags. His story is one of modern finance colliding with old-fashioned criminal law, and the law refusing to blink. And then, pattern interrupt. The gavel falls, sound cuts, and suddenly the screen explodes into crypto euphoria. Super Bowl ads promising the future of money, stadiums lit up with the FTX logo, influencers saying, "You're not too late." Champagne, laser eyes, celebrities assuring everyone it's safe. Cut back to the courtroom stillness, to handcuffs and a plain jumpsuit. The contrast is at times inspiring and at times chilling, because it's an example of what happens when hype outruns accountability. The marketing looks like a revolution, but the punishment looks exactly like every other fraud case that came before it. The message from that 25-year term is simple. Crypto is not a legal gray zone. It is just money, and when money is stolen, the old rules still apply. But a 25-year sentence still leaves one brutal question hanging in the air. If there was an $8 billion black hole, where did it all go? There was a time when people imagined a hidden vault somewhere, stacked with hardware wallets and secret keys, waiting to be cracked open. The reality is both more boring and more horrifying. The money did not sit in one place. It dissolved into an empire of trading losses, venture bets, political influence, sponsorships, and beachfront luxury that made the whole operation look legitimate right up until it collapsed. Start with Alameda. The forensic accountants who stepped in after the bankruptcy traced billions into that hedge fund casino. Because of the secret code that let Alameda run a negative balance on FTX, customer deposits quietly flowed into leverage trades, yield farming schemes, and arbitrage plays that worked in the boom and detonated in the crash. When the crypto market turned in 2022, those risky bets didn't just lose value. They blew straight through the thin layer of real equity and dug a crater into customer funds. But the life of FTX was not only about charts and leverage. Let me take you back to the peak, when the company was valued near $32 billion and the marketing machine was everywhere. Stadium naming rights in Miami, Super Bowl ads with Larry David, Tom Brady and Steph Curry telling the world this was the safe way into crypto. That spectacle was paid for with the same commingled pool of money, turning anonymous deposits into very public billboards of confidence. Then there was the venture spree. FTX and Alameda sprayed capital into dozens of startups, blockchain projects, and side deals, writing checks that made founders feel they were partnering with the future of finance. On paper, it looked like an expanding empire. In practice, It was customer money being converted into an illiquid equity in companies that might take a decade to pay off, if they ever do. Politics and charity added another layer. Bankman-Fried became one of the largest political donors in the United States, sending tens of millions to campaigns, PIACs, and advocacy groups across the spectrum. He funded pandemic preparedness research, academic centers, and effective altruism causes that talked about saving lives at scale. At times inspiring and at times chilling, those gifts turned stolen deposits into moral credibility and access to power. After the collapse, the new FTX leadership moved with a different kind of ruthlessness. The bankruptcy estate launched clawback lawsuits against politicians, celebrities, charities, and business partners, demanding the return of anything traceable to the fraud. Some campaigns quietly wrote checks back. Some charities froze grants. Others are still fighting, arguing they took the money in good faith. So what does recovery look like? Here the story turns from drama to accounting. Investigators have located crypto wallets, seized real estate in the Bahamas, liquidated venture stakes, and even benefited from the rebound in token prices. Current estimates suggest many customers may recover a large portion of their claims on paper, yet that headline hides a grim detail. Much of it is measured in dollars at 2022 prices, long after the wild upside they thought they were chasing has vanished. Because once trust has been converted into political donations, naming rights, and vaporized trades, there is no clean way to reverse the transaction. It's an example of what happens when modern systems allow a single charismatic operator to turn confidence into untraceable risk. And the real warning of FTX is not just where the money went, but how easily everyone agreed not to ask. Those unasked questions land on someone. They do not disappear into balance sheets and court filings. They crash into living rooms, marriages, and retirement plans. Behind that abstract $8 billion hole, there is a school teacher in Ohio refreshing an app that no longer loads, and a taxi driver in Nigeria staring at a spinning wheel where his life savings used to be. There was a time when FTX marketed itself as the safe on-ramp for ordinary people. A 29-year-old in Germany used it to dollar cost average into Bitcoin after work, carefully labeling a sub-account house fund. A single mother in Chile kept her emergency money there because her local currency melted faster than ice in the sun, and FTX, with its sleek design and US stadium deals, looked more trustworthy than the bank down the street. A young trader in India ran his entire operation from the exchange, rolling small wins into larger positions, convinced that his future had finally broken free from family poverty. When withdrawals froze, those lives locked up with them. The German watched 5 years of discipline vanish in a weekend. The Chilean mother had to explain to her parents why she could no longer help with medical bills. The Indian trader went from planning a wedding to explaining to his fiance's family that the money was temporarily inaccessible, even as headlines made that phrase sound like a bad joke. Because of the way trust compounded on FTX, the collapse did not just erase money, it detonated futures. The emotional toll was quiet but ruthless. Depression, anxiety, late night scrolling through Reddit threads where strangers compared losses like war wounds. Relationships broke under the weight of, "You told me this was safe." The sense of betrayal ran far beyond Sam Bankman-Fried. Customers looked at the venture funds, the celebrities, the regulators who had toured the office, and wondered whether the entire empire of modern finance was just a rotating cast of enablers. Inside FTX, the damage was not limited to headlines about executives. Many rank-and-file employees had taken lower salaries in exchange for equity that would make them whole later, or had parked their own savings on the platform they were told was rock solid. Overnight, stock options became scrap paper, and balances became locked numbers on a dead interface. Some had moved families across continents for the promise of hypergrowth. Now they were updating resumes, trying to explain to landlords why their billion-dollar employer could not cover next month's rent. Pattern interrupt. Cut from a glossy FTX commercial promising a better financial future as a famous quarterback grins at the camera, to a silent shot of a man in a dark kitchen, lit only by his phone screen, scrolling through an empty account history. No music, just the faint hum of a refrigerator and the realization that the line between early adopter and unsecured creditor is one court document. Across the crypto world, the shockwave was immediate. Startups that had relied on FTX funding watched term sheets evaporate. Legitimate projects, already fighting to prove they were not scams, now had to answer for Sam as if he were a distant cousin. Regulators, humiliated by how publicly they had been charmed, swung hard in the opposite direction, proposing rules that treated every token as a potential time bomb. The industry had wanted mainstream respect. What it received was mainstream suspicion. And yet, even here, his story is one of contradictions. Some builders doubled down on transparency, publishing real-time reserves, opening their books, trying to rebuild trust brick by brick. Others fled, taking their experiments offshore or underground. It's an example of what happens when a single failure becomes a symbol. Nuance evaporates, and the entire ecosystem pays the price. Because the real fallout of FTX is not just the people who lost money, it is the millions who will never touch crypto now, the innovators whose funding dried up, and the regulators whose next move will decide whether this was a final chapter or just the end of the prologue. There was a time when the easy answer was comforting. FTX was just one bad apple, one strange young man in cargo shorts who flew too close to the sun and finally crashed. A freak accident, a singular villain, a clean story the industry could walk away from. But once the smoke cleared, a harder question lingered over the wreckage. Was FTX an outlier, or the most successful student of a system that rewarded exactly what it did? On the surface, it looked unique, a rare cocktail of a charismatic founder who could talk effective altruism in Washington, talk high-frequency trading on Sand Hill Road, and talk gaming with retail traders on Twitter. He wrapped himself in ideology, promising to give away his wealth, sleep on a beanbag, and live for the mission. Around him sat a tiny inner circle, no real board, no seasoned risk officers, and a balance sheet that depended on a token FTX had created out of thin air and then treated as collateral. Add the backdrop: zero interest rates, pandemic stimulus, a global hunt for yield so desperate that anything with a chart going up looked like salvation. At times inspiring and at times chilling, his story is one of how a single personality can ride that wave further than anyone expects. Yet step back, and the outlines look less like a glitch and more like a pattern. Opaque offshore entities in the Bahamas, customer money flowing through a maze of related companies, an internal back door that let Alameda run a multi-billion-dollar negative balance while public marketing promised safety, token-based collateral that only held value as long as everyone agreed not to look too closely. Complexity was the product. Transparency was the cost. There was a time when this playbook did not involve crypto at all. Enron hid debt in off-balance sheet vehicles and turned accounting into theater. Lehman Brothers loaded up on opaque mortgage instruments, leveraged them to the ceiling, and trusted that housing would never fall everywhere at once. Different technology, same misaligned incentives. When executives are paid for short-term growth, when risk is someone else's problem, the empire always expands until it finally implodes. Because of those incentives, the gatekeepers matter. Investors, who were supposed to be ruthless about protecting their money, instead wrote checks after a Zoom call, bragging about getting into a $32 billion rocket ship. Auditors signed off on financials they only partially understood. Regulators argued over who had jurisdiction, while FTX bought Super Bowl ads and stadium naming rights. Media outlets ran glowing profiles of the next Warren Buffett of crypto, and only later noticed the $8 billion hole. It is an example of what happens when everyone trusts everyone else's homework. So let me take you back to that lingering question. If the culture of yield chasing, the worship of growth, and the hunger for a new golden boy all remain, what exactly stops the next genius from building a machine just as dangerous, only smarter at hiding the gears? You don't need to become a forensic accountant to survive the next FTX, but you do need to notice when a story is quietly asking you to suspend common sense in the name of innovation. There was a time when a Super Bowl commercial and a stadium name felt like due diligence. In the FTX empire, that was treated as proof. So let me take you back to the core red flags that were hiding in plain sight. First, commingling. FTX was an exchange, Alameda was a hedge fund, and they were supposed to be separate. Instead, they shared offices, executives, and most dangerously, customer money. When the place that holds your deposits is secretly funneling them to the place that makes wild bets, that is not innovation. That is a casino wiring chips out the back door. Second, the offshore maze. FTX.com was in the Bahamas. Alameda had its own web of entities, and the real action sat far from the regulators customers thought they had. Whenever a platform brags about being global but keeps its real operations in thinly regulated havens, it's an example of what happens when legal arbitrage quietly replaces basic accountability. Then the numbers: unaudited or opaque financials, glossy pitch decks instead of hard, boring balance sheets, a multi-billion-dollar company with no Big Four audit, no clear explanation of where customer assets sat, and a proprietary token, FTT, used as collateral for loans. That token was printed by the same people borrowing against it. When the house issues its own chips, values them at full price, and then uses them as collateral for more borrowing, common sense should start yelling. But the world looked away because the distractions were loud. Tom Brady, Steph Curry, Larry David. The Miami Heat arena renamed FTX Arena. Politicians praised Sam Bankman-Fried's generosity. Regulators took meetings. Think tanks took money. Celebrity endorsements, stadium naming rights, and political donations answered a question no one should care about. Who wants to be seen with this founder? They did not answer the questions that matter. Who holds the assets? Who can move them? And who checks? Those are the questions viewers can ask every time. Where are my assets held? On-chain, in omnibus accounts, or in segregated custody? What happens to my money if this company goes bankrupt? Which regulator, if any, can actually knock on their door? How are conflicts of interest handled when the platform trades against its own customers, lends to insiders, or controls its own token? And then a quieter rule that might have saved billions. Do not leave large balances on any single exchange, especially one promising high yields or complex products you do not fully understand. Diversification is boring, but in a world of charismatic founders and frictionless apps, boredom is a form of power. Because his story is one of leverage, illusion, and concentrated risk, the real lesson is simple. When everything around a platform is loud, marketing, celebrities, politics, the questions you ask must become even sharper. In the next chapter, the silence breaks, and those unanswered questions finally come due. When the silence finally broke, it didn't just swallow FTX. It cracked open the illusion that crypto lived outside the reach of ordinary law, ordinary regulators, ordinary consequences. There was a time when exchanges bragged about being offshore as if that alone was a business model. After FTX, offshore started to sound less like freedom and more like a crime scene. Around the world, regulators moved fast. The US SEC and CFTC launched new enforcement waves, suing exchanges for selling unregistered securities, misrepresenting how customer money was held, and quietly trading against their own users. In Europe, lawmakers pushed the MiCA framework, demanding licenses, capital requirements, and clear rules on custody. Singapore, Japan, and others tightened registration and reporting, sharing data, coordinating probes, and treating global crypto platforms less like quirky startups and more like systemically risky financial firms. Because of FTX's ruthless shortcuts and secret backdoors, the message from governments became blunt. If you touch customer deposits, you play by banking-style rules. The industry, suddenly on defense, tried to rewrite its own story. Major exchanges rushed out proof of reserves pages, hiring auditors to show on-chain wallets and balances. Some separated trading from custody, putting user assets into ring-fenced entities that, in theory, could survive if the main platform failed. Others adopted cold storage policies and real-time dashboards, promising that every coin was backed, traceable, and untouchable by executives looking for a late-night loan to a friendly hedge fund. It's an example of what happens when one empire implodes so loudly that everyone else scrambles to repaint their lobbies. Inside the crypto world, a deeper split opened. One side argued that FTX proved the original cypherpunk thesis. Centralized exchanges are the problem. To them, any place where a charismatic founder can freeze withdrawals, move billions with a keyboard, and fund a political life on the side is a trap waiting to spring. The other camp insisted that the answer was not abandonment, but adult supervision, regulated intermediaries, audited balance sheets, and clear lines between customer money and proprietary bets. His story is one of how a single fraud can turn a technical debate into a philosophical civil war. Then a sharp cut, the chaos of a trading floor, blinking screens, panicked chats, liquidations racing by, fades to a quiet room. On a desk, a single hardware wallet. No stadium rights, no celebrities, just a small device holding a seed phrase and a different kind of promise. That image captures the new trend. Users are drifting toward self-custody, hardware wallets, and on-chain transparency, trusting code and personal responsibility more than glossy brands. DeFi protocols with open ledgers and automatic liquidations look at times inspiring and at times chilling. Transparent but unforgiving, efficient but vulnerable to hacks, bugs, and ruthless market raids. The future after FTX is not a clean break from risk. It is a migration of risk. From hidden balance sheets and private chats to public blockchains and individual hands. And as the next wave of platforms rises, the question becomes unavoidable. Will people choose the comfort of intermediaries or the cold, demanding freedom of holding their own keys? And that choice leads straight into the most dangerous idea in this entire story, the belief that the ends can cleanse any means. There was a time when Sam wasn't being introduced as a disgraced fraudster, but as the math genius who had cracked the code on how to save the most lives per dollar. Effective altruism was his language, earning to give his slogan. Make as much money as possible, then give it away. On paper, it sounded almost unimpeachable. But buried in that neat equation is a crack. If the mission is to prevent millions of deaths from pandemics or AI, how bad can it be to bend a few financial rules? How wrong is it to move money across a few internal accounts, to massage a balance sheet, to borrow customer deposits just for a while? Once the scoreboard is measured in lives saved rather than dollars stolen, the temptation to rationalize becomes enormous. Let me take you back to those FTX pitch meetings. Sam talked about funding vaccine research, pandemic surveillance, global catastrophic risk. Venture capitalists wrote checks not just because they saw a crypto empire in the making, but because they liked the story. His story is one of a young man who promised both wealth and moral redemption, a way to feel good while chasing insane returns. That mix is rocket fuel. It also dulls the smell of smoke. When outcomes become everything, process becomes negotiable. If the only question is how many people can be helped, it becomes easier to downplay the people being hurt right now. The customers who thought FTX was the safest way to invest in crypto. The employees whose careers were vaporized overnight. The charities that suddenly discovered their benefactors' money came from an $8 billion hole in customer accounts. In the abstract, they become line items, collateral damage on the way to a grand philanthropic finale that never arrives. Because once someone starts seeing themselves as the exception, the slide is fast. Rules about leverage, disclosure, segregation of funds, those are for ordinary traders, not for the genius who sleeps on a beanbag and plans to give it all away. There was a time when tech founders talked about moving fast and breaking things. Sam added a twist: move fast, break things, then donate the winnings. It's an example of what happens when intelligence and good intentions are treated like a license rather than a responsibility. And this isn't unique to one exchange in the Bahamas. From ride-sharing apps that flouted local laws in the name of disrupting transportation, to social platforms that fueled addiction while promising to connect the world, to finance CEOs selling toxic products wrapped in the language of expanding access, the pattern repeats. Change the world. Ignore the fine print. Apologize later, if at all. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the rhetoric of impact can make even seasoned investors overlook the simplest question: who gets hurt if this goes wrong? Because the numbers on a whiteboard are never just numbers. They are rent payments, college savings, retirement plans, entire family lives compressed into a few digits. Any system that forgets that is already halfway to disaster, and FTX was a brutal reminder of what waits on the other half. FTX was a brutal reminder, but the hardest truth is this: it did not rise on Sam Bankman-Fried's code alone. It rose on desire, on millions of people quietly hoping there was finally a way to escape inflation, chaos, and uncertainty without reading a 200-page prospectus. There was a time when number go up felt like a life plan. Teachers, engineers, parents saving for their kids all opened accounts because everyone else seemed to be doing it. A Super Bowl ad here, a stadium naming deal there, a celebrity saying it was the safest way to buy crypto. Not only did that signal money and power, it created something even stronger: the feeling that this must be fine, because if it wasn't, someone richer, smarter, closer to the action would have noticed. His story is one of a self-styled math nerd in a t-shirt, but the real story is about the crowd around him. Venture funds that bragged about making investment decisions over video games. Journalists who framed a 20-something as a benevolent billionaire, sleeping on beanbags and talking about saving the world. Because of that narrative, awkward answers in interviews, missing board oversight, and a balance sheet made of vapor tokens all looked quirky instead of terrifying. Complexity finished the job. When the language turns into cross-margining, yield farming, and delta-neutral basis trades, most people tap out. the jargon becomes a kind of permission structure. If it sounds too advanced to understand, the mind quietly delegates judgment to experts, influencers, and social proof. It's an example of what happens when risk feels outsourced. Due diligence gets replaced by, well, Sequoia's in, so it must be safe. Let me take you back to those peak days for a second, a $32 billion valuation. Politicians lining up for donations. Ads featuring Tom Brady and Larry David. The signal was everywhere that this empire was solid. Yet under it, customer money was being wired into a hedge fund casino, collateralized by a token FTX had invented itself. That is not just a story about one ruthless founder. That is a mirror held up to a broader hunger for easy yield, for shortcuts that promise wealth without the boredom of patience. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the FTX saga shows how quickly branding can outrun substance. A clean logo, an arena, a few magazine covers, and visibility starts to look like credibility. When life feels unstable, that illusion is comforting, until it isn't. So the real power of this story is not watching a villain fall in handcuffs. It is what happens the next time someone offers the financial equivalent of magic. The next time, the pitch is effortless, returns, low risk, and a genius at the helm. The question is not, will another FTX appear? It is whether the crowd that built the last one will respond the same way. And that is where this story goes next. The real power of this story is not watching a villain fall in handcuffs. It is what happens the next time someone offers the financial equivalent of magic. The next time, the pitch is effortless, returns, low risk, and a genius at the helm. The question is not, will another FTX appear? It is whether the crowd that built the last one will respond the same way. Because there was a time when Sam Bankman-Fried was not a cautionary tale, he was the golden boy. A math prodigy from MIT, a Jane Street trader, the kid who could see probabilities where others saw noise. He welded a hedge fund, Alameda Research, to a global exchange, FTX, and wrapped the whole empire in jargon, effective altruism, and a promise to give his wealth away. It sounded at times inspiring and at times chilling because the money moved too fast for anyone to ask what powered it. Underneath the slogans sat the mechanics of one of the largest frauds in modern finance. A secret backdoor in the code that let Alameda run a multi-billion-dollar negative balance. Customer deposits quietly commingled and pushed into leveraged bets. A junk token, FTT, used as collateral as if it were solid gold. Then a leaked balance sheet, Binance stepping back, and suddenly a digital bank run that exposed an $8 billion black hole where customer money should have been. Let me take you back to that number for a moment. 8 billion. Not just a line in a bankruptcy filing, but homes that will never be bought, retirements that will never feel safe, college funds, medical savings, entire family plans that vanished into a spreadsheet error with a human face. When the trial ended and the 25-year sentence came down, the law closed its file. The hole in those lives did not. So what now? His story is one of charisma, complexity, and captured gatekeepers, and it is an example of what happens when a crowd agrees not to ask simple questions. The next time a platform looks too slick, the next time a founder is on magazine covers with celebrities and stadium naming rights, treat that as a starting point for skepticism, not the end of it. Question complexity wrapped in charm. Separate custody from speculation, so the place that holds your savings is not the same place making the wildest bets. And never outsource all of that skepticism. Not to celebrities running Super Bowl ads, not to blue chip investors, not even to regulators who seem impressed by the show. Treat this story as a lens for the next big thing in crypto, tech, or traditional finance, not a one-off spectacle that could never repeat. Keep learning how the systems around your money actually work. Share this story with someone who might be tempted by the next FTX. Because in markets, as in life, trust should be earned, not bought.